It's just running late, but they'll be here by the time we do all the procedure stuff. Okay, so at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of their meeting, their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 3 on the agenda is social housing financing, enhanced leasing, land initiatives and PPPs. Today's meeting will involve consideration of the topic of social housing financing, enhanced leasing, land initiatives and PPPs. So on behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome from the NTMA Ms Cathy Bryce, Mr Paul O'Neill, and from the Society of Chartered Surveyors, Ms Anya Myler and Mr Michael Cleary to today's meeting. Before we begin, just a note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Ms Bryce to make her opening statement, please.
Thank you, Eoin, and members of the committee. Thank you for your invitation to update you today on some of the social housing initiatives that the NDFA is assisting the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government with, and I'll refer to them as the Department. I am a Director of the NDFA and a member of the Executive Management Team of the NTMA, and I joined the NTMA in August of this year. I'm accompanied this morning by Paul O'Neill, who is Finance Sector Head at the NDFA and has responsibility for a number of the sectors, including housing. In terms of the NDFA, we are a statutory financial advisor to state bodies in respect of all public capital investment projects of scale. In our advisory role, the NDFA provides a number of services, including financial robustness testing, tender assessment and advice on optimum forms of funding. The NDFA also has a broader responsibility for the procurement and delivery of PPP projects, other than those in the transport sector. We have a mix of skill sets within the team, ranging from financial advisory to construction, engineering, design and project management. We've built up significant experience over the past 15 years across a range of large-scale infrastructure projects in education, justice, health, tourism, transport and energy. In addition to project delivery, we also have an active role in monitoring the operations of a significant number of PPP schemes in the state. The committee has asked me to focus on 3 topics relating to social housing delivery: public-private partnerships, land initiatives and enhanced leasing. In relation to the first of these, PPPs, our role is extensive and includes assisting the Department and the relevant local authorities with planning, design, risk transfer, procurement and delivery. From the moment the projects are handed over to us by the Secretary-General of the Department, we are formally accountable to procure these projects within a defined set of parameters, including budgetary and technical specifications. Upon completion of construction, the projects are then formally handed back to the Department and our local authorities. I should say at the outset that the NDFA has a limited role in respect of the second and third topics that the committee has asked us to comment on, namely land initiatives and enhanced leasing. I'll explain this later, but we'll first focus on PPPs. Specifically in relation to PPPs, the Government has approved 3 social housing schemes which will look to provide approximately 1,500 homes. 2 of the 3 schemes under this initiative are in procurement. The first scheme, Social Housing Bundle 1, is being coordinated by Dublin City Council on behalf of 5 local authorities and comprises 6 sites across counties Louth, Dublin, Kildare and Wicklow. In total, this scheme, a summary of which is included in the slides of the supporting document submitted to the committee, encompasses 534 homes for social housing. By way of update, following a competitive tender process, a preferred bidder for this scheme, named CORE, was selected in September 2018 and comprises a consortium of the following companies: SIS Construction, which will be primarily responsible for the construction work; Oakley and Choice Housing, which will be responsible for tenancy management and maintaining the homes over the life of the scheme, being 25 years post-construction. Macquarie, which is involved as an independent provider of equity to the project, and the debt providers are expected to include the European Investment Bank and Bank of Ireland. As is normal in a PPP scheme, the state is not required to pay any monies during construction. When the homes are delivered and made available to the intended beneficiaries, then the state will make monthly unitary payments over the 25-year life of the project to pay for the upfront cost of the assets and for the ongoing maintenance. At the end of the 25-year contract, the state fully owns these social homes. Construction is expected to begin on this scheme in Q1 2019, with all homes to be completed in 2020. The second scheme, Social Housing Bundle 2, is currently being tendered, with fully costed bids due to be received on the 1st of February 2019. There are 4 bidders in this process, the 3 bidders from the first scheme and 1 additional consortium. As for Bundle 1, all bidding consortia include a mixture of experienced contractors and approved housing bodies. This scheme is being coordinated by Cork County Council and involves 8 sites across 6 counties of Cork, Galway, Clare, Waterford, Roscommon and Kildare. In total, this scheme involves 465 homes for social housing, and we anticipate that construction will commence in Q3 2019 and all homes completed by 2021. The third scheme, Social Housing Bundle 3, is at pre-procurement. In September, the Department identified a long list of 14 potential sites. The NDFA has completed a high-level technical suitability assessment of these sites, and once the list is finalised by the Department in consultation with the local authorities, the NDFA, along with other partners, will become engaged to help drive design, planning, procurement and delivery. I have provided more detailed information in the supporting documentation on the timelines for Bundles 1 and 2. As with any large-scale public infrastructure, the timelines are considerable. The main reasons for this are that the process of selecting sites and bringing them through site preparation, design and planning does take a significant period of time. The public procurement process, which can only commence once these processes are completed, also has set timelines which must be adhered to, both for legal reasons and in order to ensure robust competitive proposals are obtained. Equally relevant here is that this is the first time the Department and local authorities have been involved in PPPs in the housing sector, which involves significant upfront work by all the parties. However, we believe there is now a very good framework in place, and in the short term, we would expect this to create efficiencies in Bundle 3 and any future delivery. In the longer term, we feel that this new channel for procuring social housing could sit alongside other methods of delivering social housing and provide additionality, something that hasn't been available to us over the past decade. I'm aware of the ongoing debate regarding PPPs and value for money. The submission of robust competitive proposals is paramount in ensuring value for money is delivered to the taxpayer. As with all PPPs, the NDFA procures on behalf of state bodies. The NDFA follows Department of Finance and Department of Public Expenditure and Reform guidelines regarding value for money. The private sector tenders must demonstrate value for money against the public sector benchmark, being the estimated cost of undertaking the project in question on a traditional basis. These guidelines are being followed in relation to the social housing PPP programme. Best practice, and indeed current practice, is to disclose further details on value for money at the appropriate time post-contract award. This has happened across the education and transport sectors, and it will also for social housing. Moving on to land initiatives. In relation to land initiatives, the NDFA is working in an advisory capacity with various local authorities around the country to assist them to procure mixed tenure developments on sites that they own. Our role primarily relates to providing advice around financial matters and tender assessment. To explain the process, local authorities identify suitable sites and specify the tenure mix they require, that is, the breakdown of social, affordable and private homes. They go out to tender seeking bids for delivery of the housing based on the tenure mix specified. At the end of construction, the social houses are owned by the local authorities. A list of schemes on which we are currently assisting is included in slide 4 in the supporting documentation. The most progressed of these schemes is Kilcarbery in South County Dublin. and South Dublin County Council has selected a preferred tenderer and expects to be able to sign a development agreement with this party in the next 2 months. Once this development agreement is signed, the preferred tenderer will apply for planning permission. This scheme is envisaged to provide approximately 975 homes, of which 30% will be social housing. On the basis of sites that we are aware of, the Land Initiative scheme has a potential to cumulatively deliver 6,500 new homes, of which approximately 1,500 would be for social housing. However, it should be noted that all of these schemes still require both planning permission and financing. In relation to enhanced leasing, as already mentioned, the role of the NDFA in relation to enhanced leasing is limited. Our involvement to date has been primarily around obtaining market soundings on behalf of the Department and providing advice in relation to the form of the lease. This scheme is being administered by the Housing Agency on behalf of the Department. The Housing Agency is responsible for the evaluation of submissions, selection of candidates and evaluation of market rents in conjunction with the local authorities. In conclusion, our primary role in relation to social housing provision relates to the 3 PPP bundles, with the first of these schemes expected to start construction in Q1 2019. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms Bryce. I'd now like to call on Ms Anya Myler, Director General of Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland, for her opening statement, please.
Thank you to the Chair and the members of the committee for this opportunity to address you today. I'm the Director General of the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland, and we're a professional body representing over 5,000 members in the property, construction and land sectors around Ireland. I'm joined today by my fellow Chartered Surveyor, Michael Cleary, who works in private practice specialising in planning, asset and development management. He co-authored the recent Society's Real Cost of Apartment Delivery and is past Chair of our Planning and Development Committee. There are 3 main elements for today's committee discussion. However, for the purposes of this opening statement, we'll focus on how improvements could be made to increase the delivery of social housing by unlocking the value and benefits of collaborating with the private sector. The Society prepared a report last year entitled The Real Cost of Apartment Delivery, which followed on from a previous report on the real cost of house delivery. The findings from both reports suggested that land and financing costs were crucial market obstacles for the development of apartment and housing schemes aimed at delivering affordable accommodation. Our apartment cost report in particular showed that costs can vary from €293,000 for a low-rise suburban Dublin apartment to €578,000 for a medium-rise apartment in Dublin City. Site costs in our report, which is now somewhat dated, varied from €33,000 per site unit to €125,000 per site unit. The justification for paying such high land costs can be difficult to understand in a market with viability challenges. However, it is well accepted that the high price paid for development land is a symptom of a market starved of well-located and service development land opportunities. In considering the finance impact on development, it is perhaps not surprising when we look for examples that the Viennese housing model, which has been highlighted as an excellent model by other bodies, is successful in having private developers assist with social housing delivery programmes. The Vienna Housing Fund attracts developers by providing very low interest rate funding, currently 1% for 30 years, and actively managing the very limited land of the city. Developers make a profit, but with these elements essentially de-risked, the necessary market returns from these investments can now be lower. We believe that it is essential that the industry as a whole, both private and public, work together to seek to improve their shared approach to solving the housing challenge we face. In the context of social housing procured by local authorities, as we are all well aware, time delays can have significant repercussions on costs and ultimately the overall housing output in schemes. It's not uncommon, whether it's procurement issues or planning and construction problems, that significantly delays can arise during housing schemes and can often lose value impact of up to 15% of units due to these delays. So the impact of unforeseen or unplanned issues can be very costly. In our view, public-private partnerships are a useful tool for risk sharing and gain sharing. When used properly, they are a good mechanism for releasing public assets to be developed in collaboration with the private sector, where the private sector provides the development capital, takes the financial risk and provides the know-how, with the public body providing the land. Part of the success of countries and cities that are addressing their housing issues well is learning from their often long experience in this sector. We believe there should be a review of the lessons learned from residential projects that didn't deliver on the housing mix originally envisaged, and this approach should be fostered across all stakeholders. This is something that will present an opportunity to the newly established Land Development Agency to engage with its sectoral expertise to create best practice guidance and support in PPP schemes and complex proposals where the critical scheme promoter role is key to a successful outcome. It's important to support public housing delivery, as the use of Part 5, while effective in delivering social units in the boom years, led to the privatisation of the knowledge, skills and the infrastructure for delivering social housing. This created a skills gap, and as internal professional resources are being developed again in the public sector, there's a real opportunity for local authorities to enhance their project knowledge by taking on the developer-promoter role for social and affordable housing. These skills will be critically important in times of reduced private supply as an anti-cyclical counterweight when public housing needs increase. Ireland needs to de-risk its own housing policies by supporting a range of public, private and not-for-profit or approved housing body entities to bring more supply to the market. For a more robust delivery system, many different development entities should be encouraged to take part. So not only private profit organisations, but also not-for-profit endeavours who meet set criteria, including scale and expertise. The approved housing body sector is to be encouraged to deliver units that can be maintained in public ownership in the long term. These schemes should focus on cost rental and social rental funding models. The Local Infrastructure Housing Activation, or LIHA funding, is welcomed by the industry and developers. The proposed Land Development Agency could prove to be a significant catalyst to free up the planning and infrastructure risks and make more state land ready for the PPP process. The agency could also be used to strategically streamline the procurement routes for residential projects. Its aim should be to become the specialist in this area and be a key resource to all state bodies and local authorities tasked with delivering our very ambitious National Development Plan and our significant critical supply of public housing. The Society has been supportive of the announcement that local authorities will once again return to the direct construction of homes. We believe the authorities must be properly resourced with access to the right skill sets, professional knowledge and expertise, so the best social housing solutions are provided without undue cost or delay. We look forward to discussing this in more detail with the committee.
Thanks. Grace?
Thank you very much for your presentations. A few questions here, and I'll start with Cathy with regard to the PPPs. Just wondering what lessons have been learned from previous PPPs that weren't delivered or completed during the recession period. Okay. And have you identified any improvements or a better model of PPP since the lessons learned from the recession? And then, in your opinion, would it be possible for local authorities to deliver the same quantity of housing without land initiative and or PPPs? Okay. I'll just start with that.
Yeah, I think it's important to make a clarification. I think what you're referring to are the regeneration scheme PPPs, which were used the same name but were very different to the model that I have referred to here in relation to the social housing bundle 1, 2 and 3, because those schemes never envisaged that the private sector would operate and maintain the houses over a long period. They were really upfront schemes. They were similar in some ways and many ways to the land initiative schemes that I referred to in my opening remarks, although slightly different in terms of how they're bid, and maybe I'd ask Paul O'Neill to just explain that.
Yes, definitely. So the current initiatives, just to maybe take the Kilcarberry project as an example, which was in our opening statement, the local authorities set a tenure mix of 70% private units, 30% social units, and they engage a contractor through a bidding process. So the contractor bids in the value of the cost of building the social units, which is the payment then from the local authority to the contractor. But separately, the contractor also bids in a land contribution payment, which it proposes to make to the council in return for the residual land. So they're both separate payments, whereas in the previous land swap deals in the past, the payments were more aligned or more linked to each other, in which case if when the land values at the time decreased, it had implications for the project, for the projects in question. But the current learnings and the new structures in place now, those payments are separate. Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully that answers that first question. In relation to quantity, I think the scale of what is required to be delivered, the numbers of social housing that are forecast to be required, I think it would be very challenging for any one channel to provide them, and that certainly we do see the PPPs, the land initiatives, the enhanced leasing and other methods as really providing hopefully significant accretion possibilities to achieve the very demanding numbers that are sought. Certainly the local authorities building directly themselves will be a mainstay of the delivery, but these other channels do provide an opportunity to bring increased supply and to broaden, if you want, the availability of skill sets by using some private sector companies involved in these different schemes.
Just with regard to the local authorities, I mean, you identified that the skill sets, that there's been a lapse period almost. Like, how do you see it functioning for the local authorities to be able to deliver when there is such a deficit at the moment of skill?
Well, I think it is being built back up. I think, one of the things we would say in general in relation to social housing is that I think the stop-start is very difficult, and both in relation to PPPs as well, that if we were to do these first 3 bundles and then stop, it will take quite a lot of effort to restart again, and the same with the local authorities. I think that skill set. So I think it's important to try and keep continuity, some continuity in all of the channels, if at all possible. I think the local authorities are building up their skill set effectively. We've worked with great people in the local authorities, or I should say the team. I'm relatively newly joined. In working on developing these PPP schemes, and we'd certainly like to try and keep that continuity of experience now that it has been got after a relative amount of hard grafting, if you want. So I think it's a challenge overall for the industry, because we're suddenly into this upsurge of construction right across, not just social housing, but housing in general and other office schemes, etc. And maybe my colleagues would comment further on that. But
yeah, sorry, absolutely. Michael Cleary from the Society of Chartered Surveyors. As a practitioner, I've been involved about 25 years in delivering on the planning and development. And so we've been involved as development managers at the coalface, and the good, the bad, the ugly and the good again. So I have some direct experience of this. And it does a couple of points on this. One, exactly the point made by Cathy, is that the delivery mechanisms are very difficult to get up and going again. We have seen it, we spent 10 years while NAMA led the way in terms of trying to revitalise the industry overall, that it took a number of years to get even commercial projects up and running. Residential projects by their nature are much more complex, because you're dealing with individuals, all of us here, and you're trying to satisfy a market need, both social and also affordable, which we didn't mention here, but it's extremely important. The two issues around planning and development are, in terms of the delivery process, is the planning mix, so and also the tenure, so who's going to own the end product. So you're all the time trying to work to that, and then you have a constraint in terms of what can be financed, and these two are competing issues. And obviously the NDFA have set out a process, and that is starting to work and deliver now, again from a standing start. But the private sector has a part to play here as well, and I suppose in some of those initiatives by as referred to in Kilcarbery and other local authorities themselves have upskilled with the necessary people in place now to deliver on that. But one of the things, again, as someone who's been doing this for about 25 years, we need to look just beyond the immediate issue, and it is an important issue, and all the all the evidence is there that we need to address it. However, we do also then need to think beyond that so that we don't get caught in this scenario again. And since 2011 or 2012, I think the Society of Chartered Surveyors has been trying to promote some kind of an entity that would act like the example being the Customs House Development Authority, which it was originally, the Docklands Development Authority, some entity on a national scale that would keep an eye on the future as to what should happen in terms of its remit. And the remit for the Docklands Development Authority was the redevelopment of the Docklands area. It had a bad experience coming near the end of its shelf life, but it was quite good up to then. But we need something similar at this stage, and we welcome the Land Development Agency. We haven't seen fully what its remit is. However, anything that can add to the knowledge base, can pick out sites strategically that need to be delivered, and that you can remove the planning issues around that the private sector won't or can't take the risk on, that will deliver on infrastructural issues such as sewage, power, all these things. And then, not only that, have them shovel ready then, so that when the private sector comes, and it's either through the NDFA process as outlined, or through some other process, that it's de-risked the site. And if it's also then kept one eye on the mix, on the use mix, which is important in terms of the type of mix. So our experience has been, and we won't mention them here, but we've been involved and seen projects 15, 20 years ago that don't even make the headlines, where they started out with the best of intent by local authorities. We went through the process, we lived it, we all thought we did the right thing. And last week, the week before, I drove by one, brought my kids in around and said, look, we all thought we were going to do something great here and it hasn't worked out. Those are the lessons to be learned, and I think that kind of corporate knowledge needs to be provided to something like the Land Development Agency, and I just picked that as an example, so that this can be handed down. And the second part on this point is the anti-cyclical thing. So a lot of finance is based on the fact that there is some kind of consistent profit or something being returned because to pay for the input. So you do need a consistent level of output that's providing the housing in the locations that's needed. And it goes back to the NDFA's point as well, in that this takes a long time to put these skill sets in place. And when they are in place, they should be encouraged to perform. They should be analysed and brought in front of committees like this quite regularly to see how they're performing, but then they should be tweaked as need be, but only in a small way and over a long duration, because the arc of delivery on housing is 10, 15, 20 years. So we strongly believe that that needs a forward plan and to be supported in that way. Thank you.
Further questions, Grace?
I'll stop for the moment.
Desi?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I suppose when you were talking about the PPPs, you were talking a lot about the regeneration ones. I just refer to the Scribblestown one there in Finglas that's coming up now before Christmas, and I think that's 100% social, as far as I'm aware. And I was just curious how the reputation of PPP is, over the years, hasn't been great in terms of delivery and how they've been operating. And I'm just trying to figure out how this is going to be much better than previous PPPs, the likes of the Scribblestown. You know, the previous PPPs that we had seen and that were supposed to operate, some of them have, the shovel has been turned on some of them about 6 times, as far as I'm aware. And I just find it very frustrating that it's taken so long. And the whole pulling together of the public and the private, etc., that has been a major problem. I'm told by the management of Dublin City Council that we should be starting in Scribblestown before Christmas, but I suspect it'll probably go to the new year. The other thing I wanted to ask about was, in a lot of these PPPs, you're talking about them being managed by voluntary housing bodies, the likes of Oakley and Choice Housing and that, you know. And while I've always been a great believer in the local authorities building more and actually having their own companies to build, or even employing private firms to build for the local authorities, I think it's a much more straightforward mechanism in terms of delivery, and could deliver a lot more. And that brings me to what's planned for Coultry there in Ballymun. There's 400 units planned there, and that's what's called the cost rental. And from my conversations with Dublin City Council, they're talking about the price rental would be $1,000 a month or thereabouts. And we know that in Ballymun or in that general area, you're talking about probably 1,500 or 1,600 at the moment. But I'm just not sure about the value in terms of cost rental on this site when you think that the land has been given over, you know, and you've put various different figures in terms of land prices, 33,000 upwards, 50,000, etc., and how, you know, how it's worked out. I would much prefer to see that local authorities were building social and affordable housing rather than going down the road of PPPs. And I'm not asking you to give an answer on that, because I don't expect you would. The other issue, I suppose, for me, I've always wondered why apartments are so dear compared to housing. I've never quite got my head around it, because when I go back a number of years ago, I always believed that it was much cheaper to build apartments. Why all of a sudden, in the last year or two, we now hear that apartments are an awful lot dearer? I'm still puzzled by that, you know, because if you build 100 units in a block, surely it's much cheaper than building 20 or 30 houses or 40 houses or wherever, the equivalent. I wish someone could explain that to me, because it's never sunk in. The main builders that you have is CISCs, is it? That's going to do all the PPPs, or is it a mixture of builders?
Just Bundle 1. They are in the consortium who have been selected for Bundle 1. In relation to the Bundle 2, there are 4 different consortia bidding still. 4 different contracting firms bidding.
Yeah. And that's over, these are done before they're handed over to the local authorities fully, is after 25 years. That's the general way it's run, is it? Yeah,
just to clarify, the land remains owned by the state for all of the period. And the houses will always be state houses. So they are managed over the 25 years by the private sector, but to be handed back with a useful life. So they have to be handed back in a set condition, not, you know, and that's monitored. And there would be penalties if the houses were not in a suitable condition at the end of the period.
Right.
So they are state houses on state land, and I think that's an important clarification. Again, going back to just maybe, should I try and pick up on some of those points, Deputy? In relation to what was called PPP schemes, the regeneration schemes, they are not similar to what I have described as the current initiatives. They were quite different. They, as I said, they were much more akin to the land initiatives, whereby the private sector was going to build a mixture of private and social homes with the idea that they would, you know, use some of the monies from selling the private land and houses to subsidise the social homes, and they were short-term type contractual arrangements. These are long-term arrangements. I take your point in relation to local authorities, and I think my understanding is that actually the mainstay of delivering social housing, the very significant requirements for social housing over the next number of years, is through the local authorities doing their own building and doing their own management. And in relation to the cost rental site that you mentioned, we don't have any involvement with that site, as I understand it, the Ballymun site, so I couldn't comment in relation to that.
It's only going out to tender, but it's in one block that they're doing it, and it's going to be cost rental. I just...
I know,
I'm not asking you to comment, I'm just aware of it, you know.
The Scribblestown site is indeed part of Bundle 1. We expect construction to start in Q1 in relation to that, as per my opening statement.
Right.
In relation to apartments, I might ask Oireachtas to comment on that.
Well, indeed, and I know that that has been a factor for many people looking at the costing. I suppose what we find with our quantity surveyor colleagues and project managing who were involved in the provision of that report, along with planning and development surveyors, is that there's a very different cost delivery for suburban low-rise apartments, because they're the closest to standard residential construction. It's when you take it out of that sector, you bring it into maybe constrained sites first of all, so they're working in maybe city centre sites and things like that. But the regulatory system for the development of apartments is significantly different to housing once you go below, above 3 stories. You're building in a very different way. There's a significant, obviously, fire safety regulations that are required. There are a significant amount of common area space that actually isn't present, obviously, in houses, because everything inside the 4 walls of the house is actually owned by and occupied. So there are significant, just additional regulatory factors for the delivery of I won't even call it high-rise, it's medium-rise apartments, which including obviously the cost of the land, but obviously the finance too, because when you think about apartments, you can't sell one the day you're finished the ground floor apartment. It's the entire block that has to be held and finished out satisfactorily before anything at all can be sold in the scheme. So even the finance costs of developing apartment blocks are considerably different to the finance costs for developing housing, where literally when you top out the first house and you finish the site works around it, you could potentially sell that property and fund the next phases of schemes. So finance and land and regulatory frameworks have a very significant impact on the delivery of apartments over those sort of standard suburban models that you see.
So you're saying effectively that in say greenfield sites, and you build lower apartment blocks, they'll work out cheaper in the sense that okay, I know there's restraints in terms of the time you have to get everything done and before you get people in and you recover your costs, but in terms of that it would be cheaper then to build, say, 3 and 4 stories in greenfield sites. A lot of your problem is in the likes of the city, where you have to squeeze into spots and things like that. That's basically what you're saying.
That is part of it. It's part of it for sure. And I think maybe the sort of innovative approach, even to be fair to Dublin City Council, that they're looking at from a volumetric delivery and the modular building kind of concepts that are being, encouraged and resourced at this point in time, may actually start to show some, reduction. But to be fair, we're only in the infancy really of the delivery of those types of schemes, and they're often more expensive at the start just to prove the model, and then potentially when you get scale into the marketplace, that will start to actually bring down costs.
Okay.
Exactly. But with regard to other countries, because I absolutely agree with Deputy Ellis, in terms of scale, when you're scaling up more apartments, the model system, every apartment's going to be the same standard model probably. But I just agree, I just don't understand how the costs of the apartments can have risen so much, and in other countries is it like that? And I understand you want to prove the model, but countries like the Netherlands, Germany, it's a standard for decades now. So again, just that question: why are they? Is it market driven just because there's such a demand there at the moment?
I suppose the trust of what we always. Our general advice here is that the land piece is always the most expensive intangible in a rate per square foot, because it's the bit that's not tendered. It's usually procured. If it's not owned by public, if it's owned by private, it's usually bid on. So it's your capacity to bid on and win that skews everything else. The construction cost element, you can actually measure that quite readily. So any good QS can, whether it's a social apartment, so you have full transparency on the construction cost, or a private apartment, you can tell pretty quickly as to what the cost of the lift car is, what the cost of the lights are, what the cost of every element is. There are a number of factors, I suppose, as to why it's expensive in Ireland. Some of those are the technical issues, which Áine has alluded to, and in terms of basement car parking, things like that. The amount of apartments that must be put off one core, the more apartments that you put off a core, so off a lift shaft and a stairwell, that helps. The amount of single or dual aspect apartments. In other countries you've referred to, they'll have single aspect apartments, which means you can fit more apartments around the core with singular aspect. Does that make it a better apartment or a worse apartment? That's for someone else to decide, but in terms of reducing costs, that's a way of reducing costs. The third part in all of that is the finance cost piece, which goes back to what we referenced, the Viennese housing model, but the Dutch have a model as well, whereby if you can de-risk, which is the point we've been emphasising along the way, if you can de-risk this process, and if you can either provide the land with planning, along with what we said maybe the Land Development Agency could do, then you're de-risking it all the time, so you're handing someone, I need you to produce and deliver the X number of housing or apartment units, and the finance cost would be really, really cheap then, because the risk level will have dropped all the way, because you'll have removed the infrastructure risk, you'll have moved the planning risk, and you'll have de-risked it. So those are ways. And I suppose the other unfortunate piece, and going back to a point I think you raised yourself in terms of in 1993, the second day in the job, I was with a developer and he got a bill of quantities and threw it across the room and said, I can't believe apartments are that expensive to build in Ireland. So the point being, and the grey-haired QS, who I wasn't at the time but I'm turning into now, who was in the room, said the reason this was the way it was one of the issues was that Ireland is an island, and unfortunately the transfer of labour, the amount of procurement of all of these goods, that's the other part of all this, has to come from somewhere else. So when you're dealing in Holland, when you're dealing in mainland Europe, it's incredible. And in the downturn we did a lot of work in London and in Germany, and it was incredible where they would resource and get their equipment from and their inputs from. They could move them across overnight. It takes an age to get them to Ireland. So it's a variety of factors.
And thanks for the presentations. I was watching on the monitor earlier, so I caught your earlier contributions. I cannot. It would take a lot of convincing on your part to convince me that there's any point in even looking at public-private partnerships. So could you explain to me how, under any circumstances at all, it could be cheaper, faster and more efficient to go through what just seems to me inevitably a more complex, cumbersome process where you have to involve private sector actors and their concerns about risk, about the market, and so on, right? And we have to essentially pander to them and de-risk things for them. I mean, you know, is that the job of the state, to de-risk things for the private sector, as against us using our own money to build on land that we own ourselves, therefore taking out the land, the site cost or whatever you call it, right, and just building houses at the cost that is needed to get architects in, design them, put in the infrastructure, and then get the brickies, the carpenters and the electricians and the rest to go in and put them up. And a building worker will tell you, if you've got the basics done, you'll build a house in 6 weeks. So I just do not understand how it just is going on and on and on. And I would like to ask in that regard about a specific site, which is Shangana. I understand that various options that are being discussed for the Shangana site have been referred to you because the council, inexplicably in my opinion, is required to look at PPP. The elected councillors don't want PPP. I'm absolutely certain the people of the area don't want PPP. They just want public and affordable housing for the people on the list and the people who are above the income threshold for the list but who can't afford to buy in the private market. That's what they want, to rent or buy in the private market. And it seems to me that it's just logically, obviously the case that if you just did that as one big bundle, the council put in the infrastructure, design the stuff themselves, build at because they can obviously build at the lowest possible cost, because it's them that are doing it. They don't have to go for outside finance. They don't have to borrow if we use our own money, right? And don't borrow, but use the state's own money to build. And there's no risk involved, because we know there's plenty of people on the housing list to take those houses. We know there's plenty of people who can't buy in the private market, who will be, jumping over each other to take the cost rental and the affordable. So, is there any case under which the model I'm setting out would be less efficient than all of these PPPs, and with all the complexities and other considerations that necessarily have to be brought into them?
Okay, maybe first of all in relation to Shangana.
Richard Villa, I'm going to take Owen in with you because he has oral PQs.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Of course.
Sorry, Cathy, I'll just take Owen in.
Sorry.
Thanks, Chair. And my questions follow up from Richard, and thanks for the presentations. And also just, I suppose, to acknowledge the very useful work that the Chartered Surveyors do in terms of your cost of construction reports. They're very valuable, and while we do now have the department's reports, it says something that in fact it was your organisation that was producing those reports well before any government agency, both on houses and apartments. To the NDFA, I don't want to have an ideological discussion about public-private partnerships. I'd like to actually get some facts. And one of the great tragedies of your presentations is, while they're very useful, they don't give us the kind of facts that we need as a committee to try and answer some of the very legitimate questions that Richard is raising. Part of the problem is because of this great mysterious thing called the public sector benchmark. So it's an exercise that takes place where qualified officials from the department and local authorities, in the case of the PPP bundles, determine what it would cost for the public sector to do this particular piece of work. That's then locked away in secret, and elected members and councils and the Oireachtas aren't allowed to see it. But obviously then when tenders come in, they're compared against that to see, are we getting value for money? My concern, however, is until I actually see how you do that, I'm not convinced that it can capture the reality of what happened. So if I'm tendering for a PPP bundle, such as the first PPP bundle, I have to look at the cost of the build. So that's the labour and the materials. I have to bring my own finance, which is probably more expensive than public sector finance from the HFA or other sources. I have to factor in the maintenance of that property over a 25-year period, which is a pretty tricky business, and therefore there's an element of risk which will be factored into those costs. And then I have to make my premium. Now, anybody who knows anything about local authority delivery of housing knows the local authority at no stage gets the full cost recovery of the unit over 25 years. It doesn't get a payment, for example, on a monthly basis from anybody that covers the cost of build, finance, management, maintenance, and it certainly doesn't get a premium. One of the reasons why our social housing stock, after about 25 or 30 years, is in need of urgent regeneration is because the public sector doesn't get those availability agreements. So I suppose, first of all, how much information, detailed information, can you give us, for example, in relation to the public sector benchmark for the first bundle of the 500 PPPs? How can you assure us, in the absence of being able to see that comparison ourselves, that we're really comparing like with like in terms of the benchmarking exercise? Can you tell us at this point what the cost per unit of that first 500 bundle? The reason I'm asking that is, even on the construction end, we know the average cost, according to the Department of Housing, for social housing output at the minute is €200,000. Deeper has a slightly different figure of €216,000. You know, local elected councillors have been asked to approve planning permissions, and Oireachtas members have been asked to kind of consent to this without knowing the actual costs. So when we asked for those costs before the first tender was awarded, we were told we couldn't have them for commercial sensitivity. I assume we can now have the bundle one cost, or is that still a problem, and can you respond to that? And if you can't give us the cost or the unit cost, can you at least confirm that some of the additional costs that the private sector does require to cover the additional cost of finance and the risk factor in terms of projecting maintenance costs and the additional premium, of course means it's going to be more expensive. So it can, at least you tell us it's not like for like, that there's additional costs there. Two other concerns. You gave us two slides which are very helpful, and what they show is from conception to tenanting it's a 4-year process. Right? Now, local authorities are bad, but they're nowhere near that bad. It's now down to about 2 to 2.5 years from conception to tenanting. You have lots and lots of experience of PPPs. in other government sectors, whether it's water or schools or whatever. So is this always going to be 4 years? Do you think that this can be reduced down? When will it be reduced down? Because in fact, we're all putting lots of pressure on the Department of Housing and the local authorities to reduce their 12 to 18-month approval and tendering process below that. And then there's the contractual issues. These are 25-year contractual arrangements. They are very, very complex legal agreements. There is substantial evidence from Britain about how the use of these complex contracts for urban regeneration social housing has led to lots of difficulties. Now, we've seen with Carillion and some of these things, the beginnings of that here. How does your model factor in those less tangible risks? And can you convince us that you've done any learning from the failure of many of these public-private partnerships and regeneration projects in Britain, which have ended up costing the taxpayer substantially more than was originally agreed? And then just for the Charter of Surveyors, a brief question. One of the really interesting things that the government's own reports, the Department and the Housing Agency reports were produced, which came after your own, is on the one hand, the Housing Agency report tells us that the cost of construction is about in line with European norms, which was a really useful bit of data to get. But the Department's report kind of confirmed my reading of your own reports, particularly your apartment reports, which is it is simply not possible, given the all-in development costs that you've just outlined, for the private sector to deliver houses, but particularly apartments, for people on incomes up to €75,000, in line with the Central Bank's mortgage lending rules. Do you agree with that analysis? Am I wrong in that? Is that what the facts tell us? And if so, do we have to start relying less on the private sector with all of those complex costs to deliver housing for that sector of workers? And does your research and the two reports that I'm sure you've studied since kind of make the case that for affordable housing for modest income families, at this point in time, it really is a public sector led model, whatever about who's involved, that's really going to kind of deliver housing, for working families within that income bracket. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, there's quite a number of questions there. I'll try and cover as many as possible. In relation to maybe, first of all, PPPs and timelines, I think there's very fair comments there by the deputies in relation to the time it takes. What I would say is that because this is a new initiative or has been applying PPPs to social housing, because it was new, the local authorities and Department of Housing and ourselves had to spend a lot of time, I think, trying to really specify what we were looking for the private sector to do. I think that collaboration has been very positive, but it was time-consuming. In relation to efficiencies on Bundle 3, I do believe that some efficiencies can be got. However, I wouldn't pretend to say Bundle 3 would be a quick process, because there is a lot of time required for the design, the planning and the procurement, and there's not much one can do to shorten those timelines. I think that though Bundle 1 and Bundle 2 have been longer, because in both cases we were working with different local authorities. So Bundle 2 has been managed by Cork County Council, Bundle 1 by Dublin. So it was new for all of those local authorities. As I said, I think the collaboration has been very helpful, and I think one of the benefits that PPP does provide is that it encourages the service element and the construction element parties to get together up front and to try and really work at designing good schemes, and that maybe is something that doesn't happen with slightly more disjointed building up front and then servicing in some of the other channels. In relation to value for money and the public sector benchmark, there is a very rigid, I would say, a very detailed process that we go through in relation to the public sector benchmark, and these are all following the guidelines as laid down by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. First of all, there's an independent cost assessor who costs out the full construction cost and service element of the scheme. Those costs are reviewed in conjunction with ourselves, with the Department of Housing, and with members of each of the local authorities who are involved in assessing those costs. They are done up front, so they're not done in retrospect after bids are received. Obviously then, I think one of the most important things is that there is competition in the bidding, I think that is essential to see, and we did see good competitive tension with 3 very well thought out bids in social housing 1 and 4 now happening in social housing 2. So the winning bid is compared with the public sector benchmark, and I am unfortunately not able to give a cost per unit because we're in a live procurement. I am not able to give you the public sector benchmark at this point in time, but it will be published. But I am able to confirm that the preferred tenderer did come in below the public sector benchmark. In relation to the UK experience, I think, the NDFA would like to speak to, I suppose, the experience of PPPs across education, in this country, across education, courts, transport, and forgetting a sector, justice and health more recently. First of all, procuring any infrastructure has challenges. There is nothing easy in trying to do large-scale infrastructure, and I think we'd see both across traditional procurement and across PPPs issues do arise, for instance, in relation to Carillion and the default there. Construction companies, by their nature, do tend to it's quite a risky sector, I think it's fair to say. In terms of though the overall experience in relation to whether risk has been transferred, we have pretty good experience of risk being successfully transferred, and that really, is what I suppose gives us confidence, if you want, to believe it will work in relation to the social housing schemes. As I said, there's no one channel that is perfect. Every channel of delivery, as I see it, has their pros and cons. I think the land initiatives have pros and cons. PPPs have pros and cons, and even the local authorities doing these projects by themselves also can have issues can emerge. So I suppose that would be my comments in relation to that. In relation to risk and sharing, Deputy Barrett, I think first of all the risk is there is only one risk. It's who bears it, and in relation to PPPs, we work hard to try and make the private sector take as much on of the risk as possible. In relation to the PPP schemes for social housing, there is no demand risk, so that is clearly taken off the picture. These are all social houses on social land to stay within the remit of the state, and for the state to have full control over who goes into those homes. So that is understood up front. There is no demand risk being transferred or shared, and no pricing for that. The risk that is borne by the private sector is the risk of construction and construction cost overruns, and in today's market that is quite significant, I would say, particularly with rising inflation in the construction sector. And the private sector also take the risk of being able to maintain the houses over the 25 years and of handing them back in a suitable condition and managing them appropriately. They cost that risk and they bid on it, and that's what we assess against the public sector benchmark. Hopefully I've answered some of the questions there, but and then there was one question, I think. Yeah.
I just wanted to address the question in relation to direct provision. We're not here necessarily as proponents for any scheme today. We want to see the delivery of housing for people who need it. What I don't hear in the direct provision model at the moment is maybe an awareness of the capacity that's in the industry at the moment to deliver all of the projects that are out there, both commercial and residential. As somebody who lived in social housing for most of my early years, up to the time I got married, I absolutely take on the point of the lack of repair and management of those schemes, with probably due to lack of finance. So that's certainly something that in a direct provision model that might be proposed by government going forward for social housing would have to be addressed to ensure the longevity of the stock. And I think that maybe is something that's addressed in the PPP model, albeit there's concerns about the management of that, but at least there's a plan for the management of it. I think that's really, really important. I think you have to recognise the fact that you're in competition with the market for resources that themselves are relatively scarce at this point in time, and the market in its very nature will go to the most remunerative, most expedient project it can go to make profit, which is naturally enough that's the operation of the marketplace. But we haven't fully resourced our sector. Again, we're missing people from all types of skills areas, and social housing and public housing is in direct competition with that capacity resourcing issue at this point in time. So that's a major factor to consider.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think you referenced a particular. Yeah, so I've no knowledge of that particular site. However, just to add some knowledge to this in terms of being involved with some of these locations, on the smaller scale sites, so where there's not a huge number of housing units or apartment units to be delivered, local authorities do use the Part 8 process to allow them to deliver a planning permission, and in some cases then enter into direct contracts, as I'm aware. I suppose wearing as a planning and development surveyor on the planning side, and what we spoke of earlier on in terms of the long-term, not just the immediate issues, but the long-term issues here, is that it's preferable to have a mix of tenures insofar as you can on as much land as you can. So ideally that you have a mixture of tenures, not just social, not just affordable, but private as well. And in those scenarios, you do need the private sector potentially to take some, not construction risk, but market risk, and hopefully that offsets the cost of delivery of the social and affordable. I know you can pick examples of where that hasn't worked, but it does work as well. And so it's trying to get that balance.
Paul? Yep.
Bart's question. So we are involved with Darragh O'Brien. We have been assisting in terms of their analysis on the site, but we've that site is not being considered for PPP. Just to make that point, I'm very mindful of the councillor's requirements in terms of a 60-40 split. So we've been modelling some scenarios for the council on that behalf. So we're working with them in that context, see how that could work. And as part of that, we have looked at, for example, cost rental as an alternative for that site also, but within state ownership. So just to make that point, we're not looking to push PPPs on everything. It's very much mindful of what the councillors and local authorities are looking for.
Yeah, but is it the case, not just on Shangana, although Shangana is an example, but that we have this requirement to look at all these different models? And I mean, I just don't see the logic, especially when Cathy has more or less admitted that the PPP is a much longer timeline, and that's because it is a more complicated process. So I just don't really see the advantage of it, and even less so given the point you're making about competition, or sorry, maybe it was on here, but somebody made there about competition between the public and the private sector. Absolutely, there's limited capacity to build at the moment, and I would have thought that the state has to grab as much of that capacity as it possibly can to produce housing that's affordable, because of course, you know, the obvious danger with the private providers seeking the highest possible return is, you know, like lemmings, they all go running after the highest return, and at a certain point, because they're all looking for the same highest return, there's an oversupply in one part of the market and a chronic undersupply in another part of the market. And in fact, there's some evidence that that's happening already. That some of these guys are building stuff that nobody could ever afford to buy, or very soon the limited market that could afford, you know, the 800, 900,000 houses is going to run out, and we're going to have houses built that cost 800 or 900,000 sitting around empty when that capacity, that building capacity, should have been used to build houses that cost 200,000 or 300,000 and social housing. So I just don't see how anything from, and I know you can't comment on the sort of ideological debate, but on a purely practical level, given the limited capacity you're talking about, I don't see why you'd go for a more cumbersome, complex process, and I don't see why you would want to include a sector that is taking risks, because we can't afford to take risks with limited capacity and given the urgency. And just, sorry, one last question I didn't ask in my initial thing, but maybe you could say something about. Is your role in Part 5, or do you have any role in Part 5?
No.
None at all?
No.
Okay.
No.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I have to go to the chamber at 10:30, but if I miss any of the answers, I'll pick them up in the transcript. Just maybe, Cathy, to follow up with a couple of questions and comments. So you say there might be some efficiencies by the time we get to Bundle 3. Is there any idea of what those efficiencies are? And I presume by efficiencies you mean reduction in timeline. I have a couple of other questions. The second thing is, I don't think it's fair to say that there's nothing you can do about planning or procurement. So, for example, Part A planning permissions are now the shortest planning permissions you're going to get following the legislative changes Simon Coveney made. And in fact, many of us, both as TDs and our councillors, work very hard to ensure Part 8s get through. And even the very controversial Part 8s like the PPPs, which myself and Desi dealt with in our own constituencies, which we didn't like the funding model, we still did everything we could to make sure they got through because we wanted to make sure the units were brought into stock. So actually, planning isn't our problem here. And on procurement, for example, there is nothing to stop government allowing local authorities at a regional level having regional framework agreements for build in the same way as they do have for maintenance. Now, you might have to stagger those and have one framework agreement for builds below 20 units, below 50 units, etc. But that would significantly speed up the delivery of individual projects. You'd have a big tendering process at the start every 3 years. But then you wouldn't have to go out to tender for every single project. And if it makes sense to do that, as I think it does for maintenance contractors, it has to be within the remit of the local authorities and the likes of yourselves to do that. So I actually think you could do an awful lot of speeding up in terms of procurement. It concerns me what you say about good schemes. In fact, all of the schemes I'm looking at the minute, irrespective of the delivery mechanism, are of exceptionally high quality. We have social housing developments that have been delivered through the more standard model, and they're exceptionally high. So I don't see how you can say, by involving people in the way the PPP does, it delivers better quality schemes. And in fact, our experience from the collapse of previous PPPs suggests otherwise. On the benchmark, and you see, I suppose my question is this: what are we comparing? Are we comparing a fictional cost of what the full cost recovery of a local authority to deliver these units and maintain them over 25 years with the private sector bids? Or are we comparing the real world actual money a local authority gets for that? Because they're two very different things, and Anya, your point is really well made. So it's not that I'd like to believe you, Cathy, but I'm just one of these people who, until I see the figures, you know, even if you were my sister, I'd be saying this same thing here in the meeting today. I want to see the figures, right? Because I cannot understand, given all the additional cost factors of the private sector, and given that private developers will want full cost recovery plus a premium, and that the state, local authorities today, don't get full cost recovery at all, let alone a premium. Okay, you say it comes in below the benchmark. My suspicion is the benchmark isn't the actual reality of what local authorities get over a 25-year period for the build and maintenance. So any reassurance on that, that would be wonderful. But what I'll also, I suppose, say is, I'm delighted you're going to publish it. If you can tell us when, that would be great. But our problem then is we're scrutinising the cost after the fact. And what we've seen, for example, with the Controller and Auditor General's report, we've seen a similar report on the use of PPPs for major infrastructural projects across the European Union, published earlier this year, is that when we actually finally get to scrutinise the costs after the fact, there's lots of additional costs that shows that, in fact, it wasn't more cost effective. And in relation to your point about competition and bidding, so that happens with every social housing project. I mean, every social housing project goes out, there's a competitive tendering process. So again, I don't see how that works any differently. My final point is, housing is not a school. And this is probably one of the big things that I think the British experience shows. People live in houses. They use them far more in terms of depreciation and damage and repair and maintenance than a school or a water treatment plant, for example. And therefore, the variability or the possibility of cost fluctuating for the maintenance over the 25 years is far greater. And we also know in some of our housing estates we have other problems that we have to deal with. So it's not that the experience of PPPs in other sectors isn't relevant, of course it is, but I hope you would accept that housing, just by the very nature of what it is used for, there are greater cost variations and risk factors which makes a straight comparison with, for example, a school or a water treatment plant more difficult.
Okay.
Oh, she might be very disappointed.
She's upstairs and I get a kick in the shins later.
The door might be locked when you go back up.
I do very much take your point, Deputy, that housing is not a school, although we have learned a lot about with the delays of the schools this year and the impact that has on local communities. And I think maybe your point is that social housing is even that multiplied, and take your point. A lot of thought has gone in terms of developing these schemes, in terms of the community aspect. So there are detailed requirements in the project agreement around things like energy management, helping tenants with energy management, helping set up schemes with good community services, good community play environments, etc. And I know a lot of that work is also done in relation to all the work that the local authorities do. When I spoke about the collaboration between contractors and housing associations, it was actually mainly around that long-term maintenance piece, about how you build properties so that they will be still in good condition at the end of the 25 years and will have more life, that they will continue on. I totally take your point that the local authorities may have not, over the years, been given sufficient money to allow maintenance of properties on an ongoing basis. That is not to say that those costs aren't there. The fact that the money isn't spent is just potentially, and maybe the Chartered Surveyors could comment more on this, but potentially is leading to greater issues down the line, where if you leave something for too long, you don't maintain, does it require a lot more money to refurbish it? And you talked about the issues around looking at trying to refurbish houses. So the PPP model has attempted, does try to really focus the mind on the longer term asset, because it is a state asset at all times. It is state land, state assets, state homes, and the focus has been trying to make those homes in good condition at the end of the period. There are costs and there are risks. Deputy Barrett talked about taking on risks. Once the state wants to build houses or build schools or build hospitals and maintain them, there are risks involved in that. So it's not that anyone is taking on additional risks, it's just that they are inherent in the projects, and it's trying to find the best ways of trying to manage those risks, I suppose. We think that it does make sense to ask the private sector to help manage some of those risks. And it helps them to focus their mind on the longer term assets, not just build things that are going to look fine for the first number of years, but maybe not stand the test of time. So I think the PPP model attempts to do that, and in that sense, I think it has merit. You talked about panels and efficiencies. The efficiencies that we see happening is that once we have the sites identified, we know how to, now we have sort of reasonably well thought out with the local authorities that if there are schemes across the different local authorities, which we expect there would be, that how that would work, how that management and oversight would work is now well advanced. So we see some efficiencies there. I'm also looking at, to your point, on the procurement side, I'm looking at it, having recently, I suppose, joined the agency, to see with my colleagues if we can squeeze those timelines further, because everybody in the NDFA and in the local authorities and the department that we work with, our aim is to provide these as fast as we can, but as safely as we can. And, believe you me, we want to try and make this process quicker. But what I would say is around the timelines, we know that this housing issue is out there for the next 5 to 10 years. yes, we need to have short-term measures, and there's various agencies looking at that. But these homes delivered next year, the year after, the year after, the year after, these are very, very valuable to the overall, the solution. And probably just to put in context, then, PPP is a relatively small amount of the solution as proposed. This, we talk about it quite a lot as though it's providing 50% or something like that. It's nowhere near that. It is a relatively small proportion. Maybe just over.
The timeline application of the public sector benchmark
is, well, it's I suppose slightly complicated because we're in a programme. We really
after the third bundle is what you're saying.
No, I potentially, yeah. It's either after the second bundle or after the third. And the reason there is not to do with not wanting to be transparent with deputies or with local authorities. It is around trying to avoid the private sector having more information than we would like them to have in relation to the bidding process.
You could tell us in secret. We wouldn't tell them.
Take it offline.
Sorry, just. The Society of Chartered Surveyors obviously encompasses not only P&Ds and QSs but general practice surveyors and some within that who do a lot of research on housing stock and the amount. And just to that point in terms of delivery, there are various views out there not only on the amount we need going forward but on the obsolescence rate. So stuff we've built that's 30 years old that's may need to be replaced, and even the numbers that the NDFA have referred to there in terms of their delivery still won't meet that demand level. And I just made a note of 3 recent assessments there, and they vary between 6,000, this is just the obsolescence rate, not the immediate demand rate, to 16,000. And some members within the SCSI would say it could be closer to 6, some would say it's closer to 16. However, even if you pick any of those ranges, you still need a variety of mechanisms to deliver on this. And I suppose from the Society's point of view, just from discussing with our members, the NDFA's role in delivering that is absolutely needed because you need some mechanism there. And we did we started from a standing start in that, as I said earlier on, NAMA had the market was in disarray and it took a long while to get going, and NAMA had to do the commercial elements first to inject life back into the industry. And second of all, AHBs and others are providing a role there, and it is about, I suppose, your points that we would see that private and public, not only in the PPP process, but generally coming together can offer some real solutions. And unfortunately, going back to the cost query which was raised before, and whether through public procurement alone, if you can deliver better, a more efficient way of delivering for an affordable cost rental model. The reality is all processes should be tested. So we say the private sector should be involved in trying to deliver those because it will deliver efficiencies, and the public sector should be as well. So we're not discounting.
My question is, on the basis of your research and the subsequent 2 reports, today, can a private sector-led development produce quality homes or apartments for people on gross incomes of €75,000 a year or less? And it would seem from all of the evidence of the 4 reports, your 2 and the other 2, the answer to that is no. Am I wrong in that?
Can I just come in maybe on that point? I think if you focus on housing, yes, it could. Apartments are a whole different ball of wax, frankly. I think that there's no 2 ways about it. We've talked a lot about housing units here today, but frankly, based on our CSO stats, we already have as much housing as we need in this country from a family unit perspective. I know that's probably difficult to hear, but just based on household size and CSO data, we already have too many houses in the country. We already have too many houses in Dublin, which is actually it's a staggering thing, really, when you think about it, when we have these critical shortages at this point in time. So we actually need to be really focusing on the delivery of apartments. Now, Desi, you referred to it earlier about why does it cost so much more. Frankly, we're not all that experienced at it. It's a very small part of our market to date. It's been something that we felt was sort of short-term leasing rather than anything long-term. I'm originally from Ballymun, so in fact that was the apartment scheme actually that was supposed to lead out on what it was going to be like, and actually they were really good units, but poorly managed over time, and we all know what happened to that particular scheme. So, and there's a mistake you wouldn't want to repeat. But at the same token, we're also talking about the context of our cities, of our economy and everything else, and we need to get building apartments, and at this point in time, based on current regs, based on sizes, based on location, you know, I would think that the private market could not deliver, public apartments at this point in time. No, or even potentially on the average income, which was borne up by our report last year, which is a massive concern to us.
Apologies, Chair, I have to leave. Sorry, folks.
So,
Thank you for that.
did you want to come in on something there? It's okay. All right. Just myself and Jennifer. Mattie, have you anything you want to ask? No. Okay. So it's just myself and Jennifer left. I have a number of questions just for you. Just with the establishment of the framework now, how much time do you think that is diminished from the process, if any, apart from obviously planning has been streamlined as much as possible and procurement? I presume inflation is still included in any tender document. I'm very nervous when I heard you say that something came in below benchmark. I'm very cautious when I hear that, because I'm somebody who's a huge advocate against lowest price tender. And I know I'll ask you to elaborate on that, and I'll ask Anya maybe to elaborate on that as well, because I often think that other things are taken out of that tender in order to win a contract, or prelims are taken out, or whatever, in order to offset the cost. How many units is the minimum requirement for you to get involved? Are all sites earmarked now, or have you a few more that have been mentioned to you that you'll be looking at in the future? The public appointments of staff in all local authorities, I can't remember, it was 700 or 900 staff that have been approved and granted for local authorities, predominantly in Dublin, Cork and Galway. It obviously takes time for that to go through, and by the time somebody gets approved, they might have been snapped up by the private sector, which is an issue that we have. So, Anya, I know that you mentioned about local authorities and real opportunity for them to enhance their project knowledge by taking on developer, promoter roles, social housing, and their skills. How long do you envisage that taking? I suppose it's looking into a hole. It's hard to quantify how long that'll take. When it comes to the Shangana site that Deputy Boyd Barrett mentioned, and while we disagree with what the breakup is, we both want homes on that site. That was a proposal that came forward from 3 local authority members, Councillor John Bailey, my father, Councillor Michael Merrigan and Councillor Shane O'Brien of Sinn Féin, over 2 years ago. It took about 9 months to put it together, very detailed proposals. We're all exceptionally frustrated at how long that has taken to get any answers on, and rent to buy was part of that proposal, which I understand we're going cost rental. I don't understand why a portion of the cost rental couldn't be rent to buy, when it was a scheme that was piloted, Richard, back in 2007, 2006 in Stepaside, I think it was, and was a very successful model, and actually gave people the opportunity after a number of years of renting of actually purchasing that property at an affordable rate. And I would really hope that you might look at that again when it comes to Shangana. And within that scheme there is housing options for older people that this committee has done an extensive report on, for older people to downsize in the public and the private sector. And when we look at the population in Dún Laoghaire, when we look at the demand, there's a huge proportion needed for 1-bedroom units or 1.5-bedroom units, whatever we want to call them. When it comes to the skill shortage, Anya, I know how proactive you are in this area and how engaged you are with your membership, and even trying to encourage them to come home. And in order to get them home and fill that gap, they need continuity in the construction sector and they need certainty. Does the 2040 plan provide some of that? And I know also they're competing with infrastructural projects, not residential or commercial, but they're also competing with infrastructural projects that are needed. We had a meeting yesterday on the impact of housing when it came to Brexit yesterday, and we had the SRI in and the Nevin Institute in. It was a very interesting meeting, and they talked about the materials that we get from the UK, 50% in one sector, 30% when it comes to wood products, things like that. And there is inflationary costs that could come down the line there. So it's just kind of talk around that, what your thoughts are around that. A couple more there. Michael, you said we need to look beyond the immediate. And I think that's what we are doing. In the Land Development Agency, we did have John Coleman in, and he talked about the de-risk of his site and how that will take place in practice. It was a very informative meeting, very encouraging. I presume that you will or you have met with the Land Development Agency, and there's ongoing engagement there, because I do think you play a pivotal role in that. And the removal of risk. And when we talk about risk, not just prior to a site, to a shovel being on a site, but also the risk when you're on site. And people just diminish that. They don't think there is a risk. They think people just make money. Builders are just there to make money. But whether it's one house or 500 units, there is a risk when you're on site. And whether you've acros on a renovation project and the fear of the house falling down the next day when you get there if it's not done right, there's numerous risks involved in construction that people aren't aware of. And you might just talk through a little bit of that. And I've one or two others, if that's okay. In your opinion, would it be possible for local authorities to deliver the same quantity of housing without land initiatives or PPPs? And I have my own view on that, but I'd be interested in your view on that. Land initiatives rely on private developers to deliver units. Is this the best use of public land? And again, I have my own view on that. I'd be encouraged to hear your view on that. And again, I think the Land Development Agency is a good move. And from our meeting yesterday, it was also mentioned that we can't do everything in a year. And when you have a blanket of a number of years where nothing has happened, it takes a number of years to get up and running again and get up to the level of 30,000 units a year. And just some views around that you may have. Jennifer, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I think in fairness, Marie, you've covered a lot, and I just think that there is massive concerns, and I actually believe now it's gone a culture change that is happening through the department, in the sense of when I was reading through all the different information when you spoke about the PPPs, but also the AHPs, and I think what's happening is now that the government are absolutely not encouraging local authority build. So what is actually happening is we are going down the line of the HAP. And if you look at the private rent, which we don't have enough houses, and I can categorically say that in my own area and other areas that I would deal with, there is not enough housing. We do not have enough. For starters, we're not building the right housing. We have very little two-beds. We are not building for people with disabilities, people who have specific maybe issues in the family home. Our whole criteria, I believe, and our outset is not right. I had a lady in recently with me, and she had said that there was this, I think it's called Happy is the name. Is it a Denmark project where they are now looking at putting a certain amount of houses together, but it would be all within kind of a communal area for maybe elderly people or younger people. We don't, I firmly believe that we are not looking at the bigger picture. I think we're not delivering the right stock. I think local authorities have lost all concept of building local authority houses. I mean, we built local authority houses 100 years ago. There was nothing wrong with them. And I mean, now we have this mindset of we will look at the Part 5s, which is fine because we have a lot of them going on in my own area. We're looking at the PPPs. We're looking at the Clued, Respond. But the culture change will be, you will never be able to buy your house, because in this culture change, and it is happening, and we see it, it's kind of, I suppose it's in most continents now where, like, you cannot buy your own house, so you would take on maybe a leasing scheme for 99 years or whatever. But with all these new agencies now that we are dealing with, you don't have the option to buy. And I think it's very hard on people that are working. I think it's unfair, I think, to give them that option. But I also think that the government, in your department, you need to look at encouraging land banks that local authority owned, and to go back and building local authority houses and give people that option. I think we need to look at the HAP, on the amount of money that has been spent on rented accommodation. And for example, like, these figures are way off the mark. I'll just give you Carlow again. You're saying an average house to rent in Carlow is 758. I wish, if I could, these were just figures that, I wish it was 758. Most houses now...
Where are you getting
I know,
these
were just figures that I got myself. These were, as I read, of part of that, it was the housing strategy that we were looking at recently. These are just tables that I would have got there recently in the last few days myself, just that I requested.
Because we're not talking about HAP.
I know we're not, but the problem is, Maria, and this is the problem, we're certainly not, but we're talking about houses. But you can't deliver on housing when you're putting so much money into an area of rent. And that's your biggest issue. And if you don't actually look at that, Marie, that's where we're absolutely defeating the purpose. Like, just on average, to rent a house now is, in my own area, is 1,200. We see all the increases. If we don't build, we won't be able to build if we actually don't set aside money for building, or even looking at bodies, whether it is the AHPs or whatever. And that's my biggest concern. And I think even the way we're going, like the way we're actually addressing things, the way we're not looking forward in the sense of like putting proper houses in place, apartments. I mean, like, apartments are okay for cities, and that's fine. But if you look in rural areas, and I always think rural areas are forgotten when we do all read, and we're reading books, and I come into the housing meeting every week, and the first figures we will get was, oh, well, the apartments will be in Dublin, and this is in Dublin. But we have to remember rural Ireland has to be looked after, and apartments don't suit rural Ireland. So technically what we're building is not suitable. What I think just going forward is, and even in your plan, and I've read through your opening statements and everything, what we are looking at through the PPPs is we are looking at building 3-bedroom houses all the time. We are looking at just a Pacific house. We are not looking at other areas, and that's where we're falling down as well. And I just think overall, I just believe it's not working. I think a lot more powers and money and funding, and we should be encouraging that local authorities buy land and build local authority houses. And until we go back to that stage, and it's not happening, I think our whole culture is changing. I think it's not right, and I think I've had more people come into me lately over different houses that are being given out to the AHPs, to Clúid, Respond, all these different agencies. They don't have an option. So we're encouraging something that's not right. So what I'm asking is, if we are taking this culture change, can we come to some agreement with all these different agencies that long-term people are given an option, that they can buy them, but also we have to look at where your funding is going. I mean, it's a finance agency. The money has to be accountable, and all this will not be sorted unless we stop paying millions out on HAP and rented accommodation, that we're paying more on rent long-term than we would be to build houses, and we just can't win that battle. It's unwinnable.
Thanks, Jennifer. I just meant to mention a site there. Sisk Living did it in Dunleary and George's Place, and they were 2-bedroom houses. I know they've won awards and they were superb. They're beautiful houses. I think they came in about 180,000. But there's another phase of that site. When I looked at that site, surrounded by 4- and 5-storey apartment blocks, as a state we didn't maximise the site. So while the front obviously had to be sensitive to what was already there, which is 2-storey houses opposite, the back we absolutely could have scaled that up, and there's a second phase. But I have full understanding of the cost of apartments, and I appreciate you reiterating that, because I don't think people really understand the detail that's involved in that. But in order to maximise a site like that, there's a second phase there that PPP would probably be best for, but just that we could deliver it in Dunleary at 180,000, which would reach that 75,000 income if they were for affordable units. So there were 12 for social housing, which was brilliant, but we could replicate that model. So sorry, I just meant to give that example to you. Cathy?
Yes. Just responding to Deputy O'Connor, in relation to the PPP schemes, social housing 1 and 2 and 3, all of those houses, I think to your point, will be state-owned houses, full control by the local authorities as to what tenants use those over the 25 years.
But just, and thank you, could I just clarify, the local authorities now have stopped with the new housing scheme that they have out to buy your own home. That's non-existent, as in nobody is able to buy a house now, because you have to have a 50% income coming in, you have to have someone working. So say if I won money in the morning and I applied to the local authorities to buy my house out, I cannot buy my house out. So every barrier has been put in the local authorities' way, and it's an area that you need to look at, because what we are changing our culture, and it is so unfair. I had an older couple went to buy their house recently and they couldn't buy it, and they were in a local authority house all their life. So we're actually now taking it from local authority, which I think we can change, but it seems to be, honestly, I just never seen anything like it. So like, there is no option there. There is no option. It's very rare. Sorry.
I just wanted to briefly say that 20% of social housing 1 will be 1-bedroom houses, to the point of trying to and that's specifically at the request, obviously, of the various local authorities, to accommodate older people, maybe moving to smaller accommodation, more suitable ground floor accommodation. So there is some forward planning, I can assure you, by the local authorities in relation to that. In relation to these schemes, I think overall, to the point of HAP, it's not the remit of the NDFA, but probably, everyone would say there's too much reliance at the moment for social housing on rental, and trying to move to more ownership and control in relation to the state. Coming to some of your questions, Gerlach, In relation to public land and whether it's the best use, I suppose, again, in relation to the PPP schemes, the land is remaining within the state. So if it's felt it's not the best use over time, then obviously a change of direction could happen. In relation to the land initiatives, I think there, obviously, some of that is going to provide private housing and affordable housing. Again, it's really that's a matter for the Department of Housing as to how best to utilise. But I think no matter what, it is going towards providing housing and the broader concept. So it is going some way to helping to resolve the issue and the ease on house inflation. In terms of quantity and whether these quantities could be supplied in the same way if it was all done through direct building. I think given that, I think I may have answered this question already, but I just feel that given the very significant demands in terms of quantities to be provided, that using every channel and trying to keep those channels, as I said before, to some extent, up and running rather than stepping them down, only to maybe to step them up sometime in the future, does make sense, because there's a lot of hard work goes into trying to set these schemes, both PPP schemes, land initiative schemes, enhanced leasing. There is a lot of devil in the detail, I think, in fairness, for both the local authorities to get happy that these are good schemes, that they can operate well within, for the Department of Housing to be happy with them, and then for the private sector to try and, first of all, understand them and then be able to bid on them and trying to get some efficiencies in terms of replicating. So I feel that it does appear we're at a juncture. The demands are so high that we should try to use all channels in terms of delivery. In terms of how many units, I think that relates to Social Housing 3, and it's envisaged that would be approximately 500 units. In relation to more sites, we don't have any visibility at that at the moment, and that's a decision for the Department of Housing. And obviously, as I said, we would be keen to try and keep the channel open, but they have, there are a lot of other considerations in relation to sustainability and macroeconomic factors. The PPP schemes, as you're aware, are all 100% social housing, so they have to look at the localities, whether it's suitable to bring forward sites with 100% social housing, what's the mix in the areas. So there's a lot of different considerations in relation to that. Your point in relation to lowest price tender, we are acutely aware of and very conscious of it. We're as afraid of, I suppose, private sector making too much profit out of schemes, but also of underbidding, as we've seen happen in some instances, and then contractors getting into trouble, and that in the end then causing a problem for the state in having to step in to try and resolve. So in relation to the PPP bidding criteria, 60% of the marks go towards the design and quality and management of the scheme, and 40% go to the financial, and that helps in our mind to get some balance there in the tender. So it is bid. Our sense is that it's bid very competitively across each of those criteria, which we feel is important. I think then in relation to things like staffing and skill shortage, I might ask Anya to...
Yeah, happy to address that. We have undertaken 2 significant studies in the last 5 years just to identify what the motivation factors are and what the constraint factors were. Frankly, we've probably been a bit too successful in the country in promoting technology as a panacea for employment, and obviously hugely of interest to young people. So we may well try and sell a vision of our industry, which actually has been a difficult vision to sell, what the boom-bust cycles of the last how many years, and also for the fact that we've had a relatively fragmented industry, made more so by the collapse in the economy, which has not come back together again, really, in the way that we need it to be. But also, we're defaulting to traditional forms of delivery, because we haven't had that investment in research and development and innovation. One of our calls for the last couple of years is the establishment of a Centre for Innovation in Construction, which will be a lot of off-site construction, which, again, is to pull back costs, is to be able to, deliver more efficiently, more effectively. In fact, it could be a whole area of employment in and of itself, and an exporting opportunity for this country, because we're good at this sort of thing. But we need to develop a sense that the construction and property sectors are technology sectors, and we'll only do that with the sort of combination of some sort of forward-facing, resourced strategy, to be quite honest with you. The government was going to have to get some skin in the game, I'd suggest on that. There was a significant study undertaken in the UK a few years ago, the Farmer Report. I'm sure everybody's had a look at it at this point in time, pointing out the issues that they have. They're very similar to ours. They're just bigger because it's a bigger marketplace. But you're trying to sell a future to a 15-year-old, and all you're showing them is, shortages, boom-bust cycles, negativity, and what looks like pretty much traditional block-on-block type of activity. And we need to generate a whole new vision for this sector. So thankfully, some of the off-site innovation stuff that's going on at the moment, BIM as a platform obviously is being discussed. I know that the OGP, to be fair to them, are looking very significantly at how they can make public procurement more agile, even staying within the constraints of EU directives and state aid in that sector. But, I've got a 19-year-old at home, and there isn't a chance that I could have induced him into this industry or this profession in the last 10 years. So we're challenged in that respect, and it's just something that we're constantly trying to look at, of knitting those things together, making this a sector that actually appears far more. Cathy certainly referenced it, that sort of pipeline provision, the sense that there will be work. You talked about, is the NDP a reason for people to come back home? The construction project tracker, actually, that Deeper have developed, is a really interesting tool, and as they're expanding the information on it and really starting to break down the stage, the milestones on projects, I think that's really interesting to be able to show people there is absolutely still this pipeline, and we need the capacity. So there will be a place for you. The recruitment that the local authorities are undertaking at this point in time, in competition with the marketplace that's also looking for those resources. Challenging, no doubt, but I think certainly that's our focus, is to almost we need to, not just the perception, but the delivery in the sector needs to change, and some of that is going to require investment by public and private entities.
Thanks, Vinny. Michael?
Yes, Cohere, look, you referenced, I think, the Land Development Agency again, and also just the best use of public lands and the right type of units to be delivered. Again, wearing the planning hat as a planning development surveyor, I do think looking forward, it is about making sure we have the relevant information to us. And I did reference to one of the answers earlier on about the obsolescence piece, and I did reference the fact that we have such in terms of quantifying the numbers of obsolescent housing units out there and understanding the actual number that we need to replace beyond the surges that happen. And I think that's a piece of work, just as an example, that you could take out and give to some entity like, and I just picked the Land Development Agency, but it makes someone's work stream to be done. The second part is the type of housing units to be delivered. Obviously, there are regional houses, and then there's residential units, and then there's residential units in the larger urban areas, and an assessment as to what the need not only is now, but going forward in terms of older people's housing. Also in terms of the IT sector, which has been referenced, then not only in Dublin, but hopefully some of that IT employment level would go to more of the regions as well, and within that an assessment as to what their housing type requirement is. We're involved with a number of those development schemes for some of those high-tech entities that are in Ireland and that are expanding. It's interesting, they start bringing over from where their origins are, people advising them on the type of units that they require and the short-term nature of some of the units that they require. This is very much an urban thing, I suppose, but just to try and figure out a way of delivering that and yet deal with the high-cost issues that Anya has referred to. The influence then of technology into this sector, and also the issue about long-term, the requirements for, I suppose, more energy efficiency, again, beyond what we've done so far. are, and to tie it all back to 2040. I suppose our ideal scenario from a planning and development perspective is that someone takes a 2040 plan, the equivalent then of a land development agency, and applies a various series of work streams that it can generate robust and important statistical information, and apply those then to assist in the various information elements that need to be provided, and then also actually target various sites. In terms of the availability of sites, again, just on the planning and development perspective, over the last 5 or 6 years I've been in front of a lot of the local authorities, and you talk to them about their role in the planning process, which is to zone and to manage a planning process. But sometimes you come to them with sites and they say, we never ever anticipated this as being a development site, particularly in the ownership of public utilities, in the ownership of ports, in the ownership of hospitals and other areas. And you talk to them and say, well, actually there's a way to make this usable if you do the following. And that's where the LDA will become much more important, because brownfield site delivery is probably, after we get over the issues we have now, is the next thing, because there's only a certain level we can go to in terms of building. We can't keep going beyond the existing boundary lines of our properties. And it comes back to an earlier question about the cost of delivery in the Netherlands and other places. It's easier to make a sum of it if you're in closer to public transport nodes, and it ties back to all of that, so you get a joined up thing not only on planning but on development. And I think all of that needs to be something that needs to be prioritised and not lost in the immediate discussion of just the physical delivery of units.
Thank you, Michael. Paul, do you want to comment on anything, or are you okay?
No, if I, it was just more to say on Shangaan in particular. You mentioned that I'm not aware of any decision yet in relation to the tenure mix, and cost rental is one of the options that we did look at in that respect. But from the context of it, retaining in-state ownerships, just to make that distinction as well, it wasn't looking at it from the point of view of a private sector-led initiative. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just and thank you for your report and that. Sorry, did you want to say something? Sorry, no. Oh, apologies. Oh, sorry.
Go on, Jennifer.
I suppose my biggest concern here today is the fact that we're all rebuilding Ireland, and the fact that 1/3 of 50,000 social homes is to be delivered within 2021. The fact that there's no giant up thinking with every agency to do with housing is my main concern, and I think that's where you're falling. And I think unless, saying, for example, HAP is not your remit or some other thing is not your remit, that doesn't work. Because, when you're rebuilding Ireland, and we're all under the one bracket of rebuilding Ireland, we haven't got 10,000 people homeless for no reason, and children in that. And that's the reality. And we don't have the houses. And unless we all sit down and have the conversation of all of us on the housing bodies, whether it's through all our local authorities, whether it's through all the different departments, unless that's happening, and it's not happening. And it really frightens me to think that somebody will always pass the buck for something else, because someone else will say, well, that's not my department, I have nothing to do with that. That's a worry. And the main thing is, unless we actually sit down together and have this conversation, we will be back here in 2021 and we will have no move further on. We are in a housing crisis. And I mean, to say that there's houses out there really concerns me, in the sense of, I have people that would come to my clinic that would be homeless. I can't find them anything where to live. I'm begging for help. And unless we all together join together with all the local authorities, with all the different agencies, we are not going to make this happen. And I really have concerns, because rebuilding Ireland is what we have to do. And I think, and you're right, I think people are getting disheartened, whether it's you said about your son, or whatever. I can understand that, because people are disillusioned. And it's very hard to come in here and hear things like, well, we're going to make it work, and I hope we do. And I think long term, hopefully, we have to be realistic and say we will. But it's just, I just get so disheartened. Every few weeks you come in and you bring up something, that's not this department, that's not that department. If all the departments in housing don't work together, and you can't see what's happening and what's being spent on housing initially, I just think we're not doing the taxpayers any favours. I think it's not fair on you. I think it's not fair on us that are trying to represent people in our own areas. So maybe if we all started working together, and everybody, as in the housing, I'm only talking about housing now and the housing departments, but every sector of the housing department, it's not going to work.
Okay, can I just...
Not the department.
Sorry,
so you don't need to answer questions on behalf of the department.
Yeah,
I think the report you were referring to was yesterday in relation to family homes. We have enough, and it's the smaller units that are required.
Yeah, it's that sort of supply. Yeah. I would just say the one thing before we go off that topic of delivery and models of delivery. One of the main aims of Part 5 it has its criticisms, and rightly so, certainly in certain aspects. But one of the main objectives of it was social integration. And I just don't think we should look past that as a continuous model to integrate everybody into society. So the delivery of large-scale social housing projects is laudable, absolutely, and it's necessary, but I just don't think we should look past the opportunity and the vision that we should have for everybody living in housing in this country for social integration.
I have no problem with Part 5.
But that's just more a call to action for policymakers from our perspective, that we see that as one of the laudable objectives that Part 5 might have had. It has its critics, and as I say, rightly so. It's a counter-cyclical provision in any event, which probably doesn't work in terms of supply. But I think social integration should still be an objective of our housing vision for the country.
Sorry, Chair, just briefly on that.
We're supposed to finish the session at 10. Your 30 seconds, I'll let you in.
It's just, I did ask earlier, is anybody here involved in Part 5? And I was told no.
No, you asked Cathy, or were they looking at any Part 5?
Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah.
You are involved in Part 5?
No, we're a professional membership body, so no. But I'm just saying that because we talked about it when you were out
Part 5, yeah, because we're dealing with Part 5 locally.
Because the reason I asked was that one concern that I have, and more importantly, that concern was prompted partly by the experience of Cherrywood and partly by the recent comments by Mel Reynolds, is that he's expressing fear that on a lot of these big private sites, actually the developers are in no hurry to build, or may not even be interested in building at all, and that therefore we should be taking the Part 5 bit as land up front and building on it ourselves, which I would have thought would bring you in, right? And his argument was that A, that would be cheaper, and B, we would control the timeline. Now that to me seems like a very good suggestion when you think about how many of these sites where we're hoping to get Part 5, but we're completely in the hands of a private developer who in the case of Cherrywood has already flipped some of the land. We don't know what's going to happen up there. But if we took our 10%, personally I'd like to see it to being 20% or more, but if we took our percentage as land up front and just started to build on it ourselves, that would move things forward. I don't know if you'd have any comment on that, but it seems to me a very sensible suggestion.
Can I just add a comment to that? We have land up there already, and I agree with what Richard's saying in some part, but we need to move on the land that we have right now, and a lot of it we're not doing. And I know a number of the sites that you are on, but rather than keep moving down the road, we need to work what we have now and keep adding to that, and those sites will come on stream soon enough. But if we could just focus on where we have sites that are ready to go and build in them rather than go to the more complex sites would be the view that I would take, and I would probably slightly differ with you on this.
I am asking them though, in fairness.
No, I'm asking the same question, Richard, from a different point of view. And as chair, I'm also a member and entitled to ask the same questions as you are. So what I'm asking is from both sides of the coin, when we in totality or in the end result we all want the homes. My view is slightly different, but would you have a view on that aspect?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, so the Part 5 process worked insofar as it was allowed work in the boom years, because as developments happened, they delivered. The issues around delivery are probably not that much different for the private sector as they are for the public sector, in terms of there are issues with some of those sites. I would have, and again, I'm not familiar with all of them. I'm familiar with them by name, but I'm not involved with them directly. One presumes there are probably some infrastructure issues around some of those sites that needed to be addressed. There was probably some historic title issues around some of those sites. I'm just presuming that needed to be addressed. And now it's most likely that the funding is being put in place, as has happened in the last 24 months there on a lot of these sites, and I'm presuming that these sites have a planning permission which dictates a lifespan. It's either a 5-year permission or thereabouts. So it's not in the landowner's interest, I would have thought, not to start moving on that, because the planning permission will wear out, and there's an obligation under planning law that if you don't have a certain percentage of the scheme underway within the duration of of the life of the permission, then your capacity to deliver on that permission is gone and null and void. So that's how the planning process picks up those issues and forces focus from the landowner. Again, I'm not familiar with the specific sites in question beyond just the high-level stuff I read in the paper, so I can't speak beyond that. But that's what I would point to in terms of how to make that happen. Finally on that, I would say taking those sites individually out, just as a mechanism, let's say you took 10% of the site area out, would be quite a difficult task to undertake, and probably would be along the lines of what the NDFA have to do in terms of a process to follow, because it would be by public procurement of some type to end up getting a delivery. So, and a lot of those designs don't lend themselves, even on the sites, what 10% of the site you pick is the closest to the infrastructure. Will there be ransom strips because you need to get to the infrastructure, such as the road, such as the foul sewer, etc. These are just observations that if I was advising someone who's going to go down, if I was asked by a client to say we need to do this, I'd say these are the risks, going back to the risk point, these are the risks you would need to consider before embarking on that journey.
Thank you, Michael. So on behalf of the committee, can I thank all our witnesses for attending, some very, repeat attenders, and for the ongoing information that you supply. If there is anything further that you want us to have, we'd appreciate if you'd send it on to us. But can I thank you very much, because we know we've delayed you this morning, we've gone well over time, but it's a crucial part of this committee, so we appreciate your attendance this morning. Members, can I propose that we suspend for a few moments just to allow our second round of witnesses to take their seats? Is that agreed? Thank you. So, yeah.
Maybe some independent sound testing.
Okay. So item number 4 on the agenda is social housing financing, enhanced leasing, land initiatives and PPPs. In our second session today, we'll continue our consideration of the topic of social housing financing, enhanced leasing, land initiatives and PPPs. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome from the Irish Council for Social Housing Mr Donald McManus and Mr Sean O'Connor and Dr Rory Ahern from NUI Maynooth. Before we begin, I just wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, then you continue to so do. You are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official by name or such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Mr McManus for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to members for the invitation to address you today. My name is Donald McManus, CEO of the Irish Council for Social Housing, the National Federation of Housing Associations. My colleague, Sean O'Connor, CEO of the Housing Association, one of our members and one of our active Tier 3 bodies providing housing throughout the country. Just as a background, the ICSH is the National Federation of Housing Associations with over 250 members, and collectively the sector manage 35,000 homes at affordable rents for families, older people, people with disabilities, the homeless and single people. Committee members are probably familiar with our organisation. Our members a more single purpose organisation dedicated to the management of homes and building sustainable communities. Housing associations work in partnership with local authorities, and the sector plays collectively its part in meeting the housing needs of people assessed in need by the local housing authority. Approved housing bodies are targeted to provide a third of the 50,000 homes to be provided under Rebuild in Ireland until 2021, which equates to around 15,000 homes, and the local authorities providing the bulk and remainder of social rented housing. Just as a background, in 2017, HBs in the housing association sector delivered around 2,330 long-term permanent social rented homes, and that's the highest the sector has ever recorded per year, and a third of the overall permanent delivery of social housing compared to local authorities. As part of the increased delivery by housing bodies, a number of larger Tier 3 bodies provide a significant number of homes and have ongoing development programmes over the coming years. Of the 2,330 homes delivered by the sector in 2017, 1,078 were through new construction, 760 through acquisitions, and 490 homes through long-term leasing. Specifically on the area of enhanced leasing, the Department of Housing, through the Housing Agency, has issued a second call in July for proposal under enhanced leasing as part of its delivery under Rebuild in Ireland. Enhanced leasing, it does appear to be targeted at developers for new build, vacant properties or new homes to the market to be delivered at scale with a minimum of 20 homes. Enhanced leasing was intended to complement the existing long-term measures currently available to local authorities. As currently structured, the enhanced leasing scheme provides long-term leasing arrangement whereby property owners provide maintenance services and local authorities lease the units and take on landlord responsibilities. The property owner is paid a rent up to 95% of the market rent, and local authorities collect a differential rent from the tenants. The scheme is currently framed that the provision of homes are by property owners and the other stakeholder local authorities. It's been suggested that pre-housing bodies could roll under the scheme. To date, HBs have not been involved in the scheme or involved in the design of the scheme to date. The enhanced leasing scheme could work in some cases where the HB is contracted with a local authority under a service level agreement to provide landlord-tenant service as an agent. But in our analysis, this scenario could present issues for the HB, as they could only resolve issues on the ground, such as rent arrears, performance of the lessor in providing repairs and maintenance through the local authority. The role of the HB in this scenario is quite limited, and where there are problems arising, the intervention of the local authority is the key as the other contractual partner to the lessor. Another possible arrangement which has been mooted which is not part of the scheme, could be the HB to act as landlord with the tenants signed up to the HB's own tenancy, and the HB has the flexibility to take action as and when required. The sector is open to different options, but probably on enhanced leasing, there probably are value for money aspects of enhanced leasing, and also the fact that enhanced leasing isn't permanent social housing as well. The little contact we've had with stakeholders in the private sectors, they've indicated to us there are issues around how structures, about how properties are managed. And in a sense, it's not their primary focus, private developers managing social housing. What we think is required is an investor-led lease which would attract pension and ethical funds, whereby professional non-profit housing management could be delivered by HBs over the lease and beyond. This can be off-balance sheet, and typical models in other European member states with both HBs and local authorities participating on scale. On land initiatives, many land initiatives are linked to the local authority in terms of supply of land, but obviously there are a number of measures to do with infrastructure and land for new housing development. Housing associations to increase their supply of new social rented homes, access to sites is critical, and has been critical, and to date this has been occurring on an ad hoc basis. A continuous supply of residential land and sites are central for the development pipeline of the sector to be able to meet its social housing targets. In the past, and up to 2010, HBs had access to land in local communities, including donated land with covenants by charitable bodies and land access below the market value. In addition, one of the most successful schemes for HBs was the local authority low-cost site scheme, whereby local authorities transferred with conditions sites to housing associations to allow them to provide housing and supports to people on the local authority win list. These options are now severely limited, and together with the sector virtually having no land bank of its own, this has meant the sector in recent years has had to reorganise itself and look at other routes to gain access to building sites. Some of this is necessitated working with the private sector to present sites through various turnkey and joint ventures to deliver housing. And this has been important in being able to stimulate employment for the local construction firms, as well as providing new homes. However, there are still a number of local authority sites that are currently being developed between local authorities and housing associations. Examples include Respond in Blackpool, in Cork, 2 housing in Crumlin, including in Kinsale. In addition, a number of local authority regeneration projects are supported by HBs in partnership with local authorities. Examples are Clued and St Mary's Mansion in Dublin, Fold at Duffnessmore in Dublin, and 2 in Cork and Limerick. Recently, there has been a call by the Housing Agency for expression of interest to HBs for 37 sites that are available for social and other forms of housing. These sites included those assembled through the land aggregation scheme, and this is a welcome other option for HBs to get access to land. In our view, the Land Development Agency could play a crucial role and enable activation of suitable state-owned sites for both social and affordable rental housing in a strategic manner, as well as enabling delivery with landowners in the private sector. It is important that there is a strong focus on ensuring all state land that is suitable should be made available for housing purposes. The onus should be on the public or state body to explain why this land should be not made available, not the other way around, to make sure that it will be a priority to get this land assembled for housing purposes. On the public-private partnerships, the sector has probably quite a limited role in this whole process here. A small number of HBs have worked with the private sector in a number of ways in the PPPs through the Social Housing Delivery Programme as one of the partners. There's a long lead-in time to this process, and that's one factor that has to be considered. The role tends to be more as a management agent. There's an example here on the Bundle 1 project. It's Oakley Housing is a tenant management provider. There are other bundles, Bundle 2 and Bundle 3, and you can see in the note mentioned they're across the country. But they are quite limited in terms of the numbers. There's only 1,500 units in that. The social housing PPPs are based on the provision of services to developments over a 25-year period following construction, which will include management, maintenance and the upkeep of housing and return of assets after 25 years. My colleague Sean will talk about some of the issues with leasing going forward. Finally, in terms of contributing to the housing system, in our view, the above are part of the menu of our sponsors to complement the mainstream delivery by local authorities and housing associations, and that still is the main part for delivery. Land initiatives potentially can be the biggest significant positive long-term impact on the housing and land market, as nothing has been really done since the Kenny report on the All-Party Committee in 2003. This will assist in the provision of housing to both social housing and other tenures where affordability are key concerns. We look forward to any questions or clarification from members of the committee on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McManus, and I'd like to call on Dr Hearn for his opening statement.
Thank you, committee, for the opportunity to present today. This is a vital area, and I'm really glad that you're looking at it. The presentation that I'm going to give today is based on 20 years of academic research and practitioner experience in the area of social housing and social and economic policy. I hope it provides some useful insights to the debate and how we can actually solve this continually worsening housing emergency. I think there's a real requirement to think deeply about our policies and think critically about why we're in this crisis and critically analyse our approaches. And so some of what I might say today might be quite strong, but I'd ask you to reflect on it in the spirit in which it has contributed to the debate. The new enhanced social housing leasing scheme and the social housing public-private partnerships are in fact all forms of handing social housing delivery over to the private market. It forms part of the approach within the new Land Development Agency and indeed the government's wider housing plan Rebuilding Ireland. It is the outsourcing and privatisation of social housing. It is in fact a key reason why we're in this crisis. Rather than the state itself guaranteeing the supply of new social and affordable housing by sufficiently funding and overseeing the building of housing via local authorities, cooperatives, housing associations, it is turning to the private market. And this is despite the private market's repeated failure to deliver social and affordable housing and its failure to provide value for money. The only conclusion one can draw is that our state, throughout the housing agencies and government, have an ideological aversion to the state actually building and being the developer itself, and a belief in the primacy and efficiency of the market. These approaches, the PPPs and leasing, are actually inherently risky approaches. They're marketised forms of delivery that tend to suffer from major delays or fail completely because they're dependent on whether the private sector decides to build or finance or get involved at all. There's actually no guarantee of delivery. It's down to the profitability assessments of private developers, investors and private finance and the commercial viability as they determine of these projects. And the schemes, in my experience and research, tend to be geared towards that, rather than maximising the social housing provision and providing value for money for the Irish people. We are entering a highly risky period when trying to access private finance. It is a deeply uncertain time with Brexit and Trump and so on. So what happens when you're 2 or 3 years down the road of a public-private partnership and the private developer decides it's no longer viable and pulls out? In these approaches, you hand over all control to this highly risky private market. We can see this with the latest public-private partnership housing projects, which have been over 3 years ago announced, but yet are still not at contract award stage or started. The Dublin Public-Private Partnership Lands Initiative sites are the same. They were launched over 3 years ago and there's still no building. As a result of this approach, we have public land lying idle in the midst of a crisis, while the state engages in what can be described as a form of market speculation with its land. If the state had built itself 4 years ago on this land, today it would have tens of thousands of extra social housing units. And of course, when the land is sold and transferred, it's gone. The value for money aspect of these PPPs and leasing projects is extremely dubious. The methods of analysis of value for money used by the public sector is not released, as it's deemed commercially sensitive. Therefore, there's no actual evidence way of showing that these projects are value for money. But if we look at what we do know, for example, at the cost of providing social housing via the new leasing scheme, for example, at 95% of market rent. If you take Dublin, where the average rent now is €2,000 per month, factor in that the agreements will be made in the next year or two, rents will have risen further. Over a 25-year period, it will cost €600,000 per unit to provide a house via social housing leasing, which is $420,000 per unit more expensive than building directly by local authority or by housing associations. But if you add in that you actually have the asset at the end via direct provision or local authorities or housing associations, and if you conservatively value that asset at the end of a value, let's say, of 150,000, the total cost of delivering a social housing via leasing is 750,000 per unit, which is 4 times more expensive to deliver via leasing than direct build over the long term. If you think about that, for every leased house you pay for over 25 years, you could have built 4 local authority homes. For the cost of the 10,000 leased social housing units planned over the lifetime of Rebuilding Ireland, we could be building 40,000 permanent social housing units. The approach also locks the state into paying extremely expensive rents into perpetuity. Entering lease agreements at a point of extremely high rents is not good value for money. As rents fall, which they inevitably will do at some point, the state will be left paying inflated rents. The Land Development Agency operates under a similar failed principle. It is about incentivising and making it financially viable for the private sector to build, using state land and state subsidies to deliver social housing. It's a massive transfer of wealth from the state and the people of this country to the private sector. The question is, what is the most efficient use of our national resources as a country? How can they best meet people's social needs and rights? These approaches do not use our land and finance in an effective way. They are, in fact, a form of corporate welfare, where the state is providing billions in handouts to the private commercial sector, to wealthy real estate investment trusts. There is a deep contradiction in government and state housing policy, on the one hand aiming towards affordability and social housing provision, but on the other hand working towards incentivising and subsidising and rebooting the private property industry using PPPs and leasing within this corporate welfare approach. The current housing system actually functions quite well for some, for landlords, banks and investors, but for many locked out in generation rent and homelessness, it's failing them badly. The social housing leasing actually adds to the core of our crisis. It adds further to the problem of the lack of genuinely affordable supply. In leasing, you are, like the Housing Assistance Payment Scheme, taking supply away from the housing system that could otherwise be used for rental or home purchase. The state, through these schemes, is taking from supply rather than adding to it. So why not just build through the state and not-for-profit housing associations and cooperatives, where you do not pay the additional cost of developer profit and expensive private finance, and you don't have the risk of entire project being delayed and collapsing? The evidence from my research on PPPs in 2008 showed that PPPs are 25-year projects that require huge legal contracts to manage. In the schools, for example, it meant that principals were going out with these huge contracts trying to decide if the grass had been cut long enough, whose responsibility it was to fix a window. So in these schemes in PPPs and leasing, who will be responsible for the maintenance when there's an issue over maintenance? Who will the tenant be able to raise it with? When the local authority faces a situation of that the private provider isn't doing what they should be doing, will they actually, in fact, penalise them? And of course they don't in experience, because they're in the relationship there, the contract is in place. The other issue with this is that these proposals, the work on PPPs, the private leasing, requires a huge institutional effort on the part of local authorities, the Department of Environment. This effort would be much better off putting into building public housing. We have an alternative approach which is better value for money, and you have a guaranteed approach to delivery, and that is true public housing being built by local authorities, housing associations, cooperatives. We are in the midst of a major crisis. We need to make a radical shift to building 20,000 public affordable homes using these various forms. We have the land, we have the finance, we have the fiscal space. The question is, why are we pursuing these models that do not work and have not proved value for money? Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Jennifer?
Yeah, I just want to thank you very much. You know, I felt that's what I said to our previous speakers, because I just feel, Rory, Dr. Rory, that you've hit the nail on the head, and I think that is the biggest issue that we have going forward, the lack of build in our local authority. And all local authorities have land bank, and I mean, local authorities were building houses 100 years ago, and there was never problems like we've seen today. And we are going down the private market, and I will again, and you keep on about the leasing, and I specifically noticed you mentioned leasing 3 or 4 times in your speech, because leasing is HAP, and at the end of the day we are gone down the private route of leasing, and that is why there is no giant up thinking again. And I think it's very unfair, because the problem is, if we pump money into leasing houses and renting houses, it takes away from building, and I think local authorities are more affected by this than any other body. And I just think we need to do exactly. I just think of all the particular issues that I have heard in the housing, I think I would just want to congratulate you on what you said. I think it's 100% right. And can I ask you about this new? And I actually brought up again with our previous speakers. In Denmark, there's a new. It's a cooperative housing where it's a commute where there's a build of houses. You know, where people commute, and it's kind of like where there's different, like there could be maybe wash machines together, or there could be, you know, like an area where people eat together. It's in Denmark. Are you aware of this? I'm just wondering long term, and I don't know if any of you are, I'm just wondering long term, we need to actually change our whole probably perception of housing, because people are living longer, like people are in family homes maybe that would have maybe 4 bedrooms, and now they only need a 1 bed or whatever, and you know, like older people, people with disabilities. I'm just wondering long term with the local authority, because the local authority are the key factor to all this. They're the ones that can build local authorities cheaper, and they can build them cheaper because they have the land. And the question is, why aren't local authorities building on their own land? What is the problem when we're told there's finance? What is the plan going forward to look at elderly people, people with disabilities, like downsizing, going from a 4-bed maybe to a 2-bed to a 1-bed? Now, we are told that there's figures, but like I don't see them in my area, and I can only focus on my own area, but on a national issue, and again, as I said about the thousands of people that are homeless, like it is an area that we need to look at. So maybe you could just address some of these issues. Thank you, Marie.
I'm going to take a few because we're under pressure for time, if that's okay. Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to everybody for the presentations. First of all, Donald and Sean, for yourselves, I mean, one of the things that strikes me in terms of the funding for social housing delivery, it's almost like we have 3 tiers now. So you have the various funding mechanisms for private sector-led developments, such as PPPs or enhanced leasing, where the developer gets full cost recovery plus additional premium and risk. So they get the kind of highest level of payment for what they do. You then have the approved housing body sector, which get a lower level of deal than that. So you get full build cost over the lifetime of your availability agreement. You get an element of cost recovery for the maintenance, although I'm sure there's a fair, tough haggle between yourselves and the department when you're doing that. And you get a small admin fee. And then we get the local authorities who get the build costs, don't get the availability agreement, and therefore don't get full cost recovery, have to rely on the differential rents. And it just seems to me it's not a level playing field between the 3 tiers. So I suppose I'm asking you from your perspective in terms of your direct engagement, in terms of your own projects, but also the engagement of some of your members in the PPPs, etc. Is that a fair characterisation? And where do you see, I suppose, the unfair advantage that many of us think the private sector are now getting through enhanced leasing and the PPPs with your own sector? So, for example, it's not really possible for you to apply for enhanced leasing because you need 100% capital up front, and no bank is going to lend, I imagine, to most of the Tier 3 approved housing bodies 100% capital, which is why we have the government grants, etc. The second thing is, my other concern is with respect to the public-private partnerships, and I have one in my own constituency. It'll be an approved housing body that manages it. And I suppose I'd like your views just on behalf of your members as to whether that's a space the approved housing sector wants to be in. Is it sensible for the approved housing body sector to be in that space rather than the direct delivery and management of your own stock? And likewise then with the Land Development Agency, one of the things that concerns us is if you get a plot of land from a local authority, you develop that land in accordance with what the local housing need is following your discussions with the local authority, generally speaking. But with the LDA, it almost seems like there's a prescribed 10% social, 30% affordable, possibly some flexibility in that we're now being told, but we don't know. And that doesn't seem to be based on anything other than what the market can bear in terms of the financing of the development. Again, do you think that's a fair statement? And would you have any concerns? I hear very clearly you think that the LDA, if it works with your sector, could be very beneficial in terms of accessing land. But would you have a concern in terms of large tracts of land, but with only a 10% social output and a 30% affordable output? And then, Rory, look, as you and I know, we share the perspective that you've outlined in your paper fully. I suppose the challenge for many of us is when we have, for example, the NDFA who came in earlier on today, the difficulty is because they can't release many of the hard data which would we think, allow us to evidence our claims that it's not cost effective. Is there any hard data or comparative costings that you've done at any point in your research that kind of evidence, at least for those projects, the claims that, for example, private sector-led projects through leasing or public-private partnerships offer better value for money or not? And likewise, when we put the questions to the NDFA, and if the Minister and the Department are here, they would say similar things because they have done in the past. They promote the idea of risk sharing and offloading some of the risk onto the private sector. Again, I suppose I'm not looking at your opinions on these. I'm really looking for you to present the committee with, do you have hard evidence from your research or from other people's research that demonstrates, in fact, that claim of risk sharing onto the private sector is not all it's cracked up to be, and how much of that risk ends up being rebounding back on the state? And then finally, if we have time, I suppose just a more general question to the approved housing bodies. I hear very clearly what you're saying in terms of land availability, and obviously there's issues around finance. You obviously have a significant set of targets to reach under Rebuilding Ireland over the next number of years. I know it's slightly aside from the conversation we're having, but at the same time it's connected. You know, how confident are you in terms of the pipelines of land and the availability of finance that's coming down the tracks, particularly in terms of the on-balance sheet status of the sector, that you're going to be able to meet those targets? Or do you have any concerns which you'd like to make committee aware of at this stage? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. The stats have been published now for local authority house building 2018 at the halfway point after quarters 1 and 2. The total number of new local authority builds completed by the end of June was 350. The figure for Cork City was 0. The figure for Cork County was 1. 12 of the 31 local authorities had completed 0 new local authority builds by the end of June. And we're in the middle of the greatest housing crisis in the history of the state. Current policy is clearly not working, and I think hearing alternative proposals, some of which have been outlined today, is important and useful for this committee. Dr. Hearn has given the committee a very interesting figure, which is that of 134,000 new social housing units to be delivered under Rebuilding Ireland by the end of 2021, 85% are private sector solutions, 15% are local authority new builds or AHB new builds or the like, public provision in reality. And clearly that policy is not working. I like the fact that the speakers have identified alternative approaches, alternative models, and have given examples from other European countries of a different way in which the issue can be approached. I think Austria and Denmark were quoted as examples where public housing provision was between 25 and 40% of overall stock, as compared to a mere 10% in this country. It's interesting, actually, if you look at how that came to pass. Social housing provision in Austria went ahead in leaps and bounds in the interwar period, in a society that was far less wealthy than Irish society is today. In the city of Vienna, there was 250,000 public apartments built for the working population of the city. The rent, the maximum rent at the time, was 4% of a worker's income. If you were sick, you did not pay rent. If you were unemployed, you did not pay rent. And the communities in which the apartments were provided had GP services, crash services, communal laundry and food provision. Now, if a left-wing council in Vienna can do that in the poverty of the interwar years, why can Irish society, in one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, not organise public housing provision that is even a fraction of that? And it's a question of, is there the will there? There is not the will at official level, at government level. and there needs to be a change in relation to that. I agree with the point that's been made that the way forward is public housing on public land. And my question relates to the price of building public housing on public land and the price at which public housing can be offered to workers on average wages, young people who've been locked out of the housing market. Now, the O'Coolan Co-op in Poppintree seems to have given us a glimpse of what might be possible. My understanding is that there was three-bedroom homes there delivered for around about the 170,000 mark. But we don't want to draw conclusions just from one example. So let's take a more of an overarching view of it, and there's a question in here. Some years ago, is it the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland, SCSI? Yeah. Produced stats which seem to indicate that close to 50% of the cost of a house is tied up in one of four things, namely cost of land, developer's profit, banker's profit, and state taxes. Now, it would seem to me that if you went for a policy of public housing on public land, you could fight on four fronts there. The cost of land could be provided free by the state as a contribution to tackling the housing emergency. State taxes could be waived. I don't think that's impossible. Bankers' profit would be significantly less, because if the state were to borrow at 1% or thereabouts, it would be far cheaper than a developer borrowing at, I think 6% is probably the going rate, given the risk of a private company going belly up. The bank will obviously charge more to factor in that risk. Developer profit. Well, obviously, if you had a state construction company, or in the big cities, if the councils had direct labour units, there wouldn't be a need for developer profit. If you didn't have that in place, or that in place yet, the state could hire builders, and there would be a profit to be factored in there, but it would be significantly less than developer profit. So I'm putting it to the members of the committee that those figures seem to indicate that if a house can't be built for half the price of what the market prices are at the moment, it could be built for damn close to it. Now, if you think about that, sure, I'll just finish on this. The idea of what's going on the market for 350,000 being offered for less than 200,000, that seems to me to be entirely possible, and I'd like some comment as to whether the supporters of public housing on public land feel that those are realistic figures.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, well, I suppose we're all kind of on the same hymn sheet here. And I agree very, very strongly with Rory's narrative in terms of the inefficiency, the cost, and the sort of viability, if you like, of PPPs or privatised forms of social housing delivery just being really crazy from the point of view of trying to resolve the housing crisis, and instead the need to urgently move towards direct provision of public housing on public land. So I think we're all kind of on the same hymn sheet as that. But one of the things I'm curious about is your opinion on what's happening in the private sector and its capacity to deliver. Because, I think we've well gone through how the cost of relying on the private sector to deliver public housing is going to cost us a fortune. I think Rory's added a little bit to the facts we already know there today in terms of the leasing component, and that's a fairly stark figure. You could get 4 directly built council houses for the cost of leasing 1 for 25 years, and you produce similar figures, obviously, for the overall cost of HAPS over a period of 35 years, and staggering figures of in excess of 20 billion. So that's a folly I think we all have spoken a lot about, and contrasted with the direct provision of council housing as cheaper, faster, more efficient, better at every level. But I think maybe what we haven't talked about enough, and that's the thing I'd like to get your opinion on, is where's the private market going? Because aside from the cost issue, is the private market actually capable of delivering the extent of housing that the government hopes it's going to deliver? What do you think? I mean, Mel Reynolds has made a very, very convincing argument that the private market, whatever we may think about it in terms of its capacity to deliver in social housing, and we don't think much, right? But that it just may not be able to deliver at all any kind of housing on the scale that the government imagines it's going to deliver. Because the costs for the private sector are now so high that it's becoming increasingly tenuous as to whether it is viable at all for the private sector to deliver. And that at some point it's going to become very clear that it's just not viable for the private sector, which is an even bigger reason to shift over to public sector provision. So I'd just be curious as to your thoughts on that. And given, as has already been said, that an incredible 85% of the Rebuilding Ireland plan is dependent on private sector output, it's terrifying, to be honest. It's terrifying where we're heading. So would you agree that we really have to start ringing the alarm bells on that front?
Thanks, Richard. Donald or Sean?
Finance, and I cover some of the broader issues.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Sean O'Connor, I'm Chief Executive to Housing. So I declare, I'm a surveyor by trade. So I've been in housing and construction 35 years. To me, it's clear that the solution to the housing crisis is to build more affordable and social housing, because there's too many people being housed in the private sector, and it is having an inflationary effect on rents. And increasingly now there's a trend with developers where they're building to sell to institutional investors to rent. And we compete with those institutional investors to buy blocks of flats for social housing, and we get a lot of flack, actually, for it. But our intent is to buy them and to rent them as social housing. I think there is a capacity issue in Ireland in the construction sector. After the big crash, there's a number of big firms who aren't there anymore. Some of them have been reincarnated as smaller operators, but banking finance is still a problem for a lot of firms. There's definitely a skills and a labour shortage, and that's feeding through to prices. What do we do about that? I don't know. The developers are usually focused on short term. They build and they go. And they don't even, and it's becoming even more short term because they're not necessarily, a lot of sites have been built not necessarily for owner occupiers to buy into. They're selling to investors, and hundreds of units at a time. So they're targeting one buyer and they go. I'm not sure they're particularly focused on they're not building to place make and to stay. So as a housing organisation and local authority, that's what they do. I think quite a radical solution, but you probably need to look at it, is that local authorities go back to direct building. So they're not relying on the private sector, they're not contracting out, they have their own direct labour organisations to build houses, not to maintain houses, to build houses. There's not enough work being done on training and apprenticeships in Ireland. That really needs to happen. But a key thing for me, I combine that with off-site manufacturing, where homes are built in factories in controlled conditions, and they're transported to houses. We have 3 sites on at the moment with an organisation based in Cavan, Modern Homes Ireland. 80% of the homes are made in the factory and they're transported to site. Our biggest site is in RD, 102 homes. They're going up in half the time of a traditional build. They're not as labour intensive. As a matter of fact, the only pressure we have on them now is they're exporting to England in the factory. So, you know, they're not just catering for the home market. Financially, you mentioned taxes. VAT, as an association, we pay VAT. And the Exchequer provides, as part of our funding, VAT. So it gives in one hand, you know, and it's just a madness, and it adds to the inflationary effect. A lot of things were said about things, you know, there is a reliance on the private sector. I'd like to see more done by local authorities and more done by our sector. A worrying trend for me is that through the enhanced leasing scheme, is that developers have no track record of building to stay or to manage housing, not even private housing. And yet the state seems to be looking at that sector to deliver through enhanced leasing and to manage social housing. And it's profit. There's nothing wrong with profit, but profiteering is something what's going on now, and you see it with some of the companies who are buying up housing at scale. And I think the one thing I would like to see introduced in the debate is a more mature debate about funding, because I think pension funds are a big solution to Ireland's problem. Not voucher funds, but pension funds, where they're matching pension liabilities. We are currently talking to a number of pension funds, some Irish, some non-Irish, some are union funds, which want to invest in social housing. They want ethical investment. There is no vehicle there. There is a private lease for small landlords. There's now an enhanced lease for developer-led landlords. There needs to be an investor lease where they just put the money in and they retreat. And they look to councils or associations to look after the property. The pension funds don't even actually have an interest in the property. Many of them don't want the property. So the points Rory was making about the value for money are very valid, because we currently source our money from the HFA and the pillar banks in Ireland. And we have shown that we can bring in pension funds, very substantial pension funds. The biggest is a $1 trillion American pension fund. It's been established over 100 years. And it is cheaper than us taking 25-year fixed money from the Housing Finance Agency. On a scheme of 100 units, it would probably save the state over $5 million over a 25-year term. There is no state equity required. They just pay the yield. So as a percentage of their capital deployed, typically in a range of 3 to 5% a year. And they're not interested in rent inflation. The only index and they want is European harmonised inflation, typically around 1% a year. And they don't want the property at the end. For a number of them, it's part of the deal that part of the ethical arrangement that it has to continue as social housing in perpetuity. And our problem has been, and I think it's this...
Does that mean they're lifetime leases?
No, they're a lease for 25 years.
Yeah.
And at the end of 25 years, the asset transfers to either us or to a local authority or to possibly a tenant management organisation.
They just get their yield over the 5 years?
Yes. Over the 25 years, they get whatever the agreed percentage is, say 3%, and then they have inflation added to that every year, but not rent inflation. They don't want rent inflation. But for me, the state's focus is too much about the balance sheet. So PPPs are on the balance sheet, are off the balance sheet. Enhanced leasing is theoretically off the balance sheet. This model where the asset transfers to a local authority or to us would be classed as on balance sheet. But I think there are ways around it. Our own auditors, Deloitte, and we took advice from me when I say there are ways around it, and it's successfully operating elsewhere in Europe. And my understanding, and from personal experience, is that there is walls of money queuing to come into Ireland, not dubious money, ethical investment, which are used to this type of investment in the States and in Europe, and we haven't yet got a mechanism to deal with it. And that's the main thing I would like to see. And it's not the States. The state just has to pay the revenue bill. And it's not public expenditure. It doesn't score as public expenditure, so there's no pressure on the Exchequer from that point of view.
We are pressed for time, members, so I'm going to bring in Donald and Rory, and if we've time for quick fire, we will, but we have to be out of the room by 10 past. Okay. Sorry, Donald.
Okay, just a few brief issues that were raised there in relation to almost the European context. We are like half the size of the social housing sector in the average in Europe, which is about 70%. This country is less than 8-9%, and that is tradition as well. I think if it was mentioned maybe if the wait lists were opened up, it would have a wider number of people could access public social housing. I think that's one access. What has happened in Ireland is people tend to go for schemes, like affordable schemes or cost rental schemes, which are try and create mixed tenure. So there are the two options can be looked at, where you open the eligibility for waiting lists up to higher income people, or else you put new tenures. I think it's not that complicated, to be honest, in that point of view. And certainly in our sector, we would be keen to take on house more people from median income households and higher income households to create mixed tenures. On terms of Deputy Brin's comments about our capacity to meet the targets by 2021, they're substantial, even though they're only a third of the overall targets. We have land pressures. Like, that's why we're talking to the local authorities. We don't have a huge supply of land. We thought that the land development issue could bring forward some, leaving aside its minimum requirements for social and affordable housing, but we think everything is hodgepodge in terms of land assembly. Is a bit here and a bit there. If one central body can coordinate land assembly, I think that would be useful both for local authorities and for our sector as well. In terms of finance, we have a number of sources now we hadn't got a couple of years ago. The Housing Finance Agency is the dominant player in terms of social housing finance. We also have another few growing players in the market that are coming in. A lot of this is about learning. A lot of people, as Sean said as well, ethical investors are looking at our sector and saying, look, they're looking for just a return, not any complicated agendas about ownership and so forth. They're looking for a return, and we have to sort of reach out to that. You know, it's not any wider agenda, but I think if we can widen the spread of finance options, more than one or two, I think that will be helpful, and that will help our supply. Our development pipeline at the moment is quite good for the next year or so, but then we're looking after that. If there's no land, it will tail down for that. We've relied a lot on turnkeys and joint ventures, and that will continue. But I think both local authorities and our sector have an issue with land assembly, and this debate has only happened in the last year or two, not 3 or 4 years ago. So maybe they're just some of these on the private sector side. Yeah, we're relying on 85,000 homes coming through the private rental sector, the landlord sector. We don't know what all their motivations are. The one thing we like about social housing for local authorities and the housing associations, you can control the supply, which is the non-profit motivation. With the private landlord sector, you can't control that supply. So that's why we need to reverse it and get to that point of 17% or 18% social housing in the country as an objective, and everything will fall from that as such. So I think for the next couple of years we are going to be pressurised with land supply and delivery, but we have a reasonable pipeline at the moment. We can't see last year as just one single good year, so maybe I'll let Roy.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, members. In terms of the response to some of the questions, in relation to the issue of Denmark and cooperative housing, I think there's co-housing, maybe what you're referring to. Co-housing. Yeah, co-housing, where you have different living arrangements. And I think the broader point you're making is correct, that we do need to consider how we're housing people, because, and I'll make the point again in a minute, the housing crisis is not one that has just emerged out of nowhere, and it's not just the fault of this government. It's as a result, I would argue, of 30 years of not thinking about housing and how we treat housing, what role housing has in our economy, and handing it over to the market, essentially. And so in a way we need to re-understand what role does housing play, because across the board there's so many groups affected. But in terms of the value for money issue and the hard data, there is, like, Deeper itself did its own analysis of the housing assistance payment and showed that in areas of high rental pressure the HAP is not value for money in terms of contrast to direct build. Leasing then is not going to be very different from that. And as I showed there, the costings, it would be interesting to ask the CNAG, the Comptroller and Auditor General, to come in and analyse these schemes, because they did it in terms of the schools, and they found the schools were 8 to 13% more expensive. So I think it would be good to get the CNAG in to look at these schemes and be able to, because they can look at the public sector benchmark while retaining the commercial sensibility on it and look at it, and that's how they provide it. In terms of, I did analysis of the original 2006, 7, 8 public-private partnership social housing regeneration projects. My analysis was the state was giving developers essentially public land worth 545 million. In return, they were getting social housing and community facilities worth about 250 million. So the developers, the private sector, were capturing that value. And the issue is the state doesn't put a value on the land it has, that the department looks at social housing delivered through these various schemes as essentially exchequer neutral, not a cost. But that's not putting a proper value on the land, in my view. The other issue then around risk sharing, you ask, all PPPs globally, when risks materialise in PPP projects, when problems materialise, it is always the state that has to pay for that risk, because it is the state that's responsible to deliver whatever the service is. So inevitably, and the private sector knows that, that's why they like these projects. They are guaranteed income no matter what happens. So I think that's important to see, that I think that risk sharing idea is a nonsense in reality, because when risk materialises, the state has to pay. I think at a broader level, in terms of how we're responding, and the question of the private market is a really good one, because I think that we have to see that our housing system I've argued, has gone through this shock and is fundamentally changed. We have now a fifth of households in the private rental sector. I had a class of 80 students last week. I asked them how many of them think they'll own their own home. About 10 of them put up their hand. We have a generation who are going to be in the private rental sector. And I think what we need to do is change utterly how we see social housing. We need to reimagine social housing. We need to change it to this idea of a public affordable housing that is actually available, like in Denmark and Austria, to anybody on any income. Because if we separate the social housing and the affordable housing bit, we have this constant problem of all these different issues. And I think I would agree with Donal. We need to see that it's not about tinkering around the edges. We need to move to providing a third of housing coming from the non-market, the not-for-profit sector. We need to be moving to where in Ireland a third of our housing is in the non-market sector, is in some form of social or public affordable housing, or housing associations or cooperatives. Currently it's only 10%. Because the reality is, Richard, the private sector will build. It may build 30,000 units next year. We know it's going to get near that. But it won't build affordable housing. The private sector does not build affordable housing, and that is our problem, and we've had that over the last 30 years. And so I think we need to change, and that is the change we need to make. It's a big change, but I think that's the scale of the change that's required if we're actually going to address the crisis.
Thanks, Rory. Do you want to do 1 minute of a quick fire, or are you okay? Everybody okay?
We got a scoot, unfortunately.
Sorry, we ran completely over. So on behalf of the committee, can I thank you for your attendance, your ongoing attendance at the committee. And as I always say, if there's further information you think is relevant to our research and our ongoing policy making, you might send that on to the committee as well. So this meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held next Tuesday, the 20th, 11 a.m. The impact of Brexit on Ireland's housing meeting. That's our second one. Thank you, members. Thank you very much for this.